You're underwater. That's the first thing you need to understand about what's happening right now. You're underwater inside a capsizing battleship, and the world has turned sideways in ways that don't make sense. What was the deck is now a wall. What was a wall is now somehow beneath your feet. The lights are out, water is rising, and somewhere in the darkness, men are screaming. This is December 7th, 1941, at 0808 hours, 8 minutes after the first bomb fell, and you're trapped inside the USS Oklahoma as she rolls onto her side like a dying whale. You don't know it yet, but 429 of your shipmates will die in the next few minutes. 32 will be cut out alive over the next 2 days. You're going to be one of the lucky ones, though right now, suspended in this flooding compartment with oil-slicked water climbing your legs and the steel groaning around you like a living thing in pain. Lucky seems like a word from another language, another lifetime. But let's back up. Let's go back 12 hours to when everything was still normal, when Pearl Harbor was just another Sunday coming, when the greatest danger you faced was the possibility of missing breakfast or getting assigned to a working party. Because to understand how you ended up here, cold water at your chest now, your shipmates' hands grabbing at you in the dark, the ship's hull singing its death song all around you, you need to understand what Pearl Harbor was before it became a graveyard. You need to understand that nobody saw this coming. Not the admirals, not the intelligence officers, not the radar operators who spotted a massive formation of aircraft at 7:02 hours and were told not to worry about it. Not the destroyer captain who sank a Japanese submarine at the harbor entrance at 0645 and filed a report that moved too slowly through channels to matter. Not the sailors sleeping in their bunks, or the officers having coffee in the wardroom, or the families in base housing getting their children ready for church. What you're living through right now, this moment of metal screaming and water rising, and men drowning in the dark, began because of a chain of decisions, miscalculations, and failures that stretches back years. And the most interesting part? Even the man who planned this attack, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, probably knew it was a strategic mistake. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start at the beginning, 12 hours before the bombs fell, when Pearl Harbor was still paradise. Part 2. Paradise Unaware. The Pacific Ocean breathes differently just before dawn. There's a particular quality to the darkness, a weight to the air, humid and salt-heavy, that settles over the Hawaiian Islands. In those hours, when night hasn't quite released its hold, but morning has already begun whispering at the edges of the world. On the morning of December 7, 1941, that darkness was profound, almost absolute, broken only by the running lights of ships and the occasional flicker of a cigarette on a weather deck. Imagine being there, but before everything went wrong. You're 20 years old, maybe 22. You've been in the Navy for 2 years, long enough to know the rhythms of shipboard life, short enough that you still write letters home every week describing the wonder of it all. Your bunk is narrow, stacked 3 high in a compartment deep within the hull of a battleship. The air is thick with the breathing of sleeping men, the metallic smell of paint and oil, the faint sweetness of someone's aftershave mingling with the ever-present odor of cigarette smoke that clings to everything aboard ship. You've been stationed at Pearl Harbor since the spring. The Pacific Fleet moved here from San Diego in May 1940. a decision made in Washington by men in suits who believed or hoped that American naval power sitting in Hawaiian waters might give the Japanese Empire pause in its aggressive expansion across Asia. The move was meant as a deterrent, a show of force without firing a shot. For you and the other sailors, though, it was just another port, another anchorage, another stretch of blue water ringed by green mountains. Pearl Harbor itself is a natural inlet on the southern coast of Oahu, shaped roughly like a butterfly with its wings spread. The entrance is narrow, barely wide enough for one ship to pass through at a time, guarded by a submarine net and patrol boats that kept watch day and night. Once inside, the harbor opens into several locks, each serving different purposes for the Navy. Ford Island sits in the middle like a green jewel, home to an airfield where patrol planes and fighters line up wing to wing. To the east of Ford Island, along its southeastern shore, is where the heavy iron sits. Battleship Row, your home for the past 8 months. The battleships are moored in pairs, nested together to save space in the crowded harbor. From north to south, they sit like sleeping giants. Nevada alone at the northernmost berth, then Arizona with the repair ship Vestal tied alongside. Then Tennessee paired with West Virginia, Maryland with Oklahoma outboard, and finally California at the southern end. These are not just ships. These are cities unto themselves, each carrying over 1,000 men, bristling with guns, armored like medieval fortresses, engines capable of pushing tens of thousands of tons of steel through ocean swells at 20 knots. The Navy is particular about Sundays. Even at war, or at least on the edge of war, Sunday means something. It means sleeping in for those not on watch. It means church services on the fantail, Protestant at 09:30 and Catholic at 1000. It means breakfast served a little later, the mess decks less hurried, the duty petty officers slightly more relaxed. Liberty has been granted to those who earned it, though not as many as usual. Tensions with Japan have everyone on edge, even if most of the crew doesn't know the full extent of it. There's a condition of readiness that's been set, condition yoke, which means certain watertight doors are dogged shut, certain measures taken against potential sabotage. The word from the officers is that if anything happens, it'll be sabotage from Japanese sympathizers on the island, not an actual attack. The Philippines, maybe. The Dutch East Indies, more likely. But here, 4,000 miles from Japan across the largest ocean on Earth? Impossible. You don't know it yet. But 6 aircraft carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy are positioning themselves 230 miles north of Oahu at this very moment. Their names are Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. Together, they carry 408 aircraft. At 0600 hours, the first wave of 183 planes will launch from their decks, climbing into the dark sky, forming up and turning south. The strike commander is Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, flying the lead plane. He has studied maps of Pearl Harbor until he can draw them from memory. He knows where every ship sits, where every airfield lies, where to find the ammunition depots and the oil storage tanks. But you don't know any of this. You're just trying to sleep a little longer before morning muster, grateful for the slight reduction in duties that Sunday brings. The ship rocks gently at her moorings, a subtle motion that becomes part of your unconscious awareness after months aboard. You hear the sounds of the ship breathing around you, metal expanding and contracting with the temperature changes, water lapping at the hull, the distant whir of ventilation fans moving sluggish air through the compartments. Someone snores 3 bunks over. Someone else mutters in their sleep. Outside, beyond the steel walls that enclose you, the tropical night is beginning to pale at the edges. At 0342 hours, something happens that will be lost in the chaos to come. The minesweeper, USS Condor, spots a submarine periscope near the entrance to Pearl Harbor. It's a Japanese midget submarine, one of 5 that were launched from larger fleet submarines and sent into the harbor to cause havoc among the anchored ships. The Condor alerts the destroyer USS Ward, which hunts for the sub, but loses contact in the dark waters. The message is passed up the chain of command slowly, filtered through layers of bureaucracy and disbelief. How could there be an enemy submarine here? It must be an error, or maybe one of our own boats running a drill. At 0645 hours, the Ward finds another midget sub attempting to follow a cargo ship through the anti-submarine net at the harbor entrance. The Ward attacks, firing the first American shots of World War II. The sub is struck and sinks. Again, the report goes up the chain of command. Again, it moves slowly, drowning in a sea of doubt and peacetime procedures. The base commandant is informed, but chooses to await verification before raising a general alarm. The admiral commanding the Pacific Fleet, Husband Kimmel, is notified, but decides to wait for more information. Everyone is cautious. No one wants to cry wolf. Everyone remembers that just yesterday was a Saturday, payday, which means half the crew is nursing hangovers. And the thought of a false alarm on Sunday morning is politically unappealing. At 0700 hours, the mobile radar station at Opana Point on the northern tip of Oahu picks up something extraordinary. 2 Army privates manning the set, George Elliott and Joseph Lockard, watch as a massive return appears on their oscilloscope, indicating a large group of aircraft approaching from the north. They've never seen anything like it. The signal is so strong that at first they think the equipment must be malfunctioning. But the blips keep coming, getting closer. They call the information center at Fort Shafter. The lieutenant who receives the report assumes the aircraft must be a flight of B-17 bombers expected to arrive from California that morning. He tells them not to worry about it. The 2 privates watch the blips continue their approach until the aircraft gets so close that the radar signal becomes cluttered with ground returns from the island's mountains. They shut down the set at 0745 hours, their shift over, and head to breakfast. At 0755 hours, the first bombs fall. But before that moment arrives, before the world splits open and everything changes forever, there are still a few minutes of peace. The sun has risen now, though clouds obscure it. The morning is overcast, unusual for Hawaii, but not unprecedented. The temperature hovers around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. A light wind ruffles the harbor waters. On Ford Island, mechanics are beginning their day, checking over the patrol planes lined up on the tarmac. In the barracks scattered across the island, men are waking up, thinking about breakfast, maybe church, maybe a trip into Honolulu if they can wrangle Liberty. On the battleships, skeleton crews man the watches, while the majority of the sailors sleep. On the USS Arizona, the ship's band has just finished their breakfast. They're scheduled to play during the morning color ceremony at 800. when the American flag is raised on the stern. Some of them are already making their way topside, instruments in hand. In the galleys, cooks are preparing the morning meal, filling the air with the smell of coffee and bacon and fresh bread. In the engineering spaces, firemen tend the boilers that keep steam up for auxiliary power, even when the ship is moored. In the radio room, operators listen to the crackling voice traffic, mostly routine position reports and weather updates. In the officer's wardroom, the captain's steward is setting out breakfast service, arranging silverware and coffee cups with practiced precision. And you, in your bunk 3 levels below the main deck, are just beginning to stir. Maybe you're dreaming of home, of the small town you left behind when you joined the Navy. Maybe you're thinking about the girl whose picture you keep in your locker, wondering if she's received your latest letter yet. Maybe you're not thinking of anything at all, just floating in that comfortable space between sleep and waking, where the world hasn't quite solidified into its daily demands. In 7 minutes, everything will change. The interesting thing about that last peaceful moment is that no one aboard any ship in Pearl Harbor knows it's the last peaceful moment. There's no ominous music building in the background, no darkening of the sky to signal impending doom. It's just another Sunday morning in Hawaii, slightly overcast, pleasantly warm, the sort of morning that makes you grateful for Navy life, despite the rigid discipline and the constant work and the terrible food. The sort of morning where you might lean on the rail with a cup of coffee and watch the sun try to burn through the clouds and think about how much worse life could be. The Japanese pilots have a different perspective. They've been flying for nearly 2 hours now, maintaining radio silence following Commander Fuchida's lead plane through the darkness and then into the gray light of dawn. They crossed the northern coast of Oahu about 15 minutes ago, threading through gaps in the mountain ranges, descending to attack altitude. The dive bombers are up high, waiting for their moment. The torpedo bombers are down low, skimming just above the water. The fighters are scattered throughout the formation, ready to strafe and dogfight as needed. Fuchida is looking for a specific signal that will tell his pilots whether they've achieved complete surprise or whether American forces are alert and ready to fight back. If he sees intense anti-aircraft fire, he'll give one signal. If the harbor appears peaceful, he'll give another. He circles over the harbor, studying it through binoculars. The battleships are lined up perfectly, just as the reconnaissance photographs showed. There's no sign of alarm, no aircraft taking off, no guns training skyward. He checks his watch. It's time. He gives the order. The code word is Tora, Tora, Tora. Tiger, tiger, tiger. The signal that complete surprise has been achieved. But here's something interesting that would only emerge later. While Yamamoto's staff celebrated the attack's success, the admiral himself spent December 8th, the day after Pearl Harbor, in what observers described as apparent depression. He was upset that the foreign ministry had bungled the timing of breaking off diplomatic relations, meaning the attack came while the two nations were technically still at peace. In his view, this transformed a legitimate military strike into what Americans would see as a treacherous sneak attack, exactly the kind of action that would unify rather than demoralize the enemy. He'd planned a surprise attack, yes, but one preceded by a formal declaration of war. The diplomatic failure meant Japan had struck a moral blow against itself, creating martyrs at Pearl Harbor and ensuring that American rage would be total and, sustained. And now our part 2, life in paradise before the fire. To understand what was lost that morning, you need to understand what Pearl Harbor meant to the sailors who lived there in the months before December 7th. It wasn't just a military base. It wasn't just a collection of ships and aircraft and ammunition bunkers. It was a community, a way of life, a small slice of American culture transplanted to a tropical island 8 hours by steamship from the West Coast. For most of the men stationed at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii was their first experience of life outside the continental United States. Many came from small towns in the Midwest or the South, places where the horizon was flat cornfields or rolling hills, where the ocean was something you read about in books but never actually saw. The Navy had transported them across 20,400 miles of open Pacific to an island that seemed, in many ways, like paradise itself. Oahu in 1941 was still a place largely untouched by mass tourism. Honolulu was a small city, barely 180,000 people. A mix of native Hawaiians, Japanese immigrants working the pineapple and sugarcane fields, Chinese merchants, and the increasing American military presence. Waikiki Beach was beginning to develop its hotel district, but it was nothing like the high-rise jungle it would become in later decades. You could still find quiet stretches of sand where the only sounds were breaking waves and wind through palm trees. The relationship between the Navy and the local population was complicated. The military brought money, jobs, construction projects, thousands of young men with cash in their pockets looking for entertainment. But it also brought a certain colonial attitude, a sense that Pearl Harbor and the surrounding area existed primarily to serve American strategic interests in the Pacific. The base had grown rapidly after the fleet moved from San Diego, and growing pains showed everywhere. Housing was inadequate. Recreational facilities were overcrowded. The single-channel entrance to the harbor created bottlenecks when multiple ships needed to enter or leave. Supply lines from the mainland were stretched thin. Still, for a young sailor making $36 a month as a seaman second class, Hawaii offered attractions that seemed exotic and wonderful. Liberty in Honolulu meant wandering streets where you heard 3 or 4 languages spoken, where you could buy strange fruits from sidewalk vendors, where music drifted from doorways and the air smelled of flowers and cooking fish and the sea. There was the Royal Hawaiian Hotel, pink and elegant, where officers sometimes took their wives for dinner. There was Hotel Street, where establishments of more questionable character offered entertainment of various kinds. There was the Aloha Tower, where you could watch ships come and go, their hulls cutting through the blue water, their whistles echoing across the harbor. Shipboard life in peacetime, or at least in the tense peace that characterized the final months of 1941, followed predictable rhythms. Every day had its structure, its routines, its expectations. The Navy ran on tradition and regulation, on the belief that if every man knew his place and did his job, the vast, complicated machine of a warship would operate smoothly and efficiently. Your day typically began at 0545 hours, with the bosun's pipe over the ship's loudspeakers, that distinctive 2-note whistle, followed by the call, "Reveille, reveille, all hands heave out and trice up." You'd roll out of your bunk, feet hitting the deck in the dim red lighting of the berthing compartment, and join the line at the head, the Navy's term for bathroom. 20 men trying to shave and wash and use the facilities before morning muster made for crowded conditions and short tempers. But you learn to move efficiently. After morning muster on the fantail at Ors 615, where division officers took attendance and passed the word about the day's work assignments, you'd head to the mess deck for breakfast. Navy food in 1941 wasn't sophisticated, but it was filling. Powdered eggs, bacon that was more fat than meat, toast from bread that had been baked on the tender and brought aboard by working party, coffee that was thick enough to stand a spoon in. You'd eat standing at high tables, metal trays clattering, sailors joking and complaining in equal measure, the heat from the nearby galley making the compartment even more stifling than usual. The workday began at 0800. Your assignment depended on your rating and division. If you were in the deck division, you might spend the morning chipping rust and repainting, the eternal cycle of maintenance that kept the ship's steel hide from corroding in the salt air. If you were in the engineering division, you'd be down in the bowels of the ship, checking gauges, oiling machinery, learning the complex systems that turned fuel oil into motion. If you were in the gunnery division, you'd be maintaining the big guns, those massive turrets that defined the ship's purpose as a battleship, designed to hurl 2,000-pound shells more than 20 miles. Training filled much of the schedule. The Navy of 1941 was professional but small, only about 300,000 personnel compared to the millions it would grow to by 1945. Every sailor needed to know multiple jobs because there simply weren't enough men to have specialists for everything. You learned damage control, how to fight fires, and shore up breached bulkheads and stop flooding. You learned chemical warfare defense, how to don a gas mask and operate in contaminated environments, a skill everyone prayed they'd never need, but trained for nonetheless. You learned small arms handling, how to field strip and clean a 1911 pistol or a Springfield rifle. You stood watch, 4 hours on and 8 hours off, manning posts throughout the ship, keeping an eye on instruments, logging readings, maintaining the constant vigilance that a warship requires even when sitting peacefully at anchor. Lunch came at 1200 hours, dinner at 1700 hours, both following the same general pattern as breakfast. The menu rotated on a 3-week cycle, meaning you got to know very well what day of the week it was by what appeared on your tray. Wednesday was beans and franks, Friday was fish, in deference to the Catholic sailors. Sunday, when they could manage it, featured something special. Maybe real eggs instead of powdered. Maybe ice cream for dessert. Small luxuries that made the day feel different from the monotonous routine of the rest of the week. Evenings were your own, assuming you weren't on watch. This was when the ship's community came alive. There were movies on the mess deck, 16mm films projected onto a makeshift screen, usually whatever the supply officer had managed to procure, often weeks or months old, but still eagerly watched. There were boxing matches on the fantail, gloves distributed and bets placed, and 2 sailors slugging it out under portable lights, while their shipmates cheered and catcalled. There were card games, endless games of poker and pinochle and cribbage, played for money or for cigarettes, or just for bragging rights. There were letters to write, always letters, because mail call was the highlight of every day and you had to feed the pipeline if you wanted to receive anything back. Some men had hobbies. There was the gunner's mate, who spent every spare moment carving intricate models of ships from scraps of wood. There was the radio man who had built his own crystal set and could pull in stations from as far away as San Francisco on a clear night. There was the cook who played guitar, not particularly well, but with enough enthusiasm to draw a crowd on warm evenings when he'd sit on the deck and play folk songs and sea shanties. These small human touches made shipboard life bearable, made the steel walls and the constant noise and the lack of privacy something you could endure because you were enduring it together. Liberty was the reward for good behavior and hard work. If you were lucky, you'd get liberty every third day, from evening colors at 1700 hours until Eros 700 the next morning. You'd put on your dress whites or blues depending on the season. Make sure your Dixie cup hat sat at exactly the regulation angle, and join the line waiting for the motor launch that would ferry you to the dock at Ford Island or to the main landing at the Navy Yard. From there, you'd catch a bus or hitch a ride or simply walk into Honolulu, pocket full of what little money you'd managed to save, looking for entertainment. Some sailors headed for the bars and dance halls, the Black Cat, the Two Jacks, the Mint, establishments where a beer cost 15 cents, and the jukebox played Glenn Miller and Benny Goodman. And you could dance with local girls if you were polite and bought them a drink first. Some sailors were more interested in the seedier establishments of Hotel Street, where prostitution was technically illegal, but openly tolerated as long as the right palms got greased. The military police kept an eye on things, breaking up fights before they got too serious, sending the too drunk back to base before they got into real trouble. Other sailors looked for Tamare pursuits. The Royal Hawaiian Hotel Beach was open to enlisted men on certain days. A stretch of perfect white sand and impossibly blue water where you could swim and body surf and pretend for a few hours that you were on vacation rather than serving in a navy that was inching closer to war every day. There was the Honolulu Zoo, small but free. There were movie theaters showing first-run Hollywood films, double features for a quarter. There were restaurants serving food that didn't come from a Navy galley, steaks and fresh fish and pies that tasted like home. And there were the local families who opened their homes to servicemen, particularly around the holidays. Thanksgiving 1941 saw dozens of sailors invited to dinner by Hawaiian families who understood what it meant to be far from home, who prepared feasts that made homesick young men grateful and teary-eyed. These connections mattered. They made Hawaii feel less like a military outpost and more like a place where people lived real lives, where kindness existed alongside the machinery of war. The racial dynamics of Pearl Harbor in 1941 reflected the segregated nature of American society at the time. The Navy was almost entirely white in its combat ratings. Black sailors were restricted to messman positions, serving food and cleaning officers' quarters, despite the fact that many of them were far more educated and capable than their limited roles suggested. This injustice would be highlighted by the actions of men like Doris Miller, a messman on the USS West Virginia, whose heroism during the attack would force the Navy to begin reconsidering its racist policies. But on a typical day, before December 7th, these structural inequalities were simply the way things were, accepted by many and resented by those who suffered under them. The officers lived different lives than the enlisted men. They had private cabins, better food in the wardroom, higher pay, and the weight of responsibility that came with making decisions that could mean life or death for the men under their command. Some officers were good leaders who earned their sailors' respect and even affection. Others were martinets, more concerned with regulations than with the welfare of their men, and were despised for it. The best officers understood that their crews were not machines, but human beings, that effective leadership meant knowing when to push and when to give a man a break, when to enforce discipline, and when to look the other way. Captain Franklin van Valkenburg commanded the USS Arizona. He was in his early 50s. A career Navy man who had worked his way up through the ranks over more than 3 decades of service. He was known as a fair captain, demanding but not harsh, someone who expected excellence but understood that sailors were human and made mistakes. He had only been in command of the Arizona since February 1941, but he had won the respect of his officers and crew. When the attack came, he would die on his ship's bridge, still trying to fight back, even as flames consumed the superstructure around him. Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd was aboard the Arizona on December 7th, serving as the commander of Battleship Division 1. He was beloved by the sailors who served under him, known for his habit of walking through the ship and talking to enlisted men, asking about their families, remembering names. He was 57 years old, gray-haired and distinguished, a graduate of the Naval Academy class of 1906. He too would die during the attack, probably killed by the same magazine explosion that destroyed the Arizona. His body was identified later only by his Naval Academy ring, the rest consumed by fire. These were the men who led, but it was the ordinary sailors who made the Navy function. The firemen in the engineering spaces who kept the boilers running. The signalmen who decoded and transmitted messages. The gunners' mates who maintained the weapons. The storekeepers who tracked supplies. The yeomen who handled paperwork. The bosun's mates who handled the ship's lines and boats and anchors. Every rating, every job, every man was a necessary part of the whole. By late November 1941, everyone could feel the tension ratcheting up. The Japanese Empire had been expanding aggressively across Asia for a decade. They'd invaded Manchuria in 1931, launched a full-scale war against China in 1937, occupied French Indochina in 1940 and 1941. The United States had responded with economic sanctions, cutting off oil exports to Japan, freezing Japanese assets, essentially trying to strangle the Japanese economy into submission without firing a shot. Negotiations had been ongoing in Washington between American and Japanese diplomats, but those talks were going nowhere. The Japanese were demanding that the United States lift the sanctions and recognize Japan's conquests. The United States was demanding that Japan withdraw from China and Indochina. Neither side was willing to back down. The sailors at Pearl Harbor knew something was coming. Scuttlebutt, Navy slang for gossip, and rumors ran through the ships like electricity. Some men said war with Japan was inevitable. Others thought the Japanese wouldn't dare attack American forces, that it would be suicide for a small island nation to take on the industrial might of the United States. Most figured that if war did come, it would start in the Philippines or Guam or Wake Island, the American territories that were much closer to Japanese bases and more vulnerable to attack. Almost no one thought Pearl Harbor itself was at risk. The harbor's defenses reflected this assumption. Anti-aircraft guns were mounted on the ships, but their ammunition was stored below, decks locked up, requiring permission from officers to break it out. Combat air patrols were not being flown. Long-range reconnaissance flights, which might have spotted the Japanese carrier task force approaching from the north, were not being conducted to the northwest, even though that was the most logical direction for an attack to come from. The Army Air Corps planes at Wheeler Field and Hickam Field were parked wingtip to wingtip, making them easy targets, but protecting them against the perceived greater threat of sabotage from Japanese sympathizers on the ground. Admiral Kimmel, the Pacific Fleet commander, had been warned multiple times that war with Japan was imminent, but the warnings were vague, lacking specific details about timing or targets. The last warning had come on November 27th, stating that an aggressive move by Japan was expected within days, possibly against the Philippines, Thailand, or Malaya. There was no mention of Hawaii. Kimmel increased readiness to some degree, but he didn't want to alarm his command unnecessarily or disrupt training schedules. He certainly didn't want to cry wolf and look foolish if nothing happened. In retrospect, all of this seems criminally negligent. How could the commanders at Pearl Harbor not have seen the attack coming? How could they have been so unprepared? But hindsight is always clearer than foresight. The men making decisions in late 1941 were working with incomplete information, biased assumptions, and the weight of peacetime thinking that made it hard to imagine that a real shooting war was about to start. They knew the Japanese were capable fighters, but they underestimated them. They knew Hawaii was theoretically vulnerable, but they thought the vast distance across the Pacific made it impractical as a target. They knew war was coming, but they thought they'd have warning, that there would be a formal declaration, that there would be time to prepare. They were wrong on every count. The final Saturday before the attack, December 6th, was payday. Sailors lined up at pay tables to collect their monthly wages, usually paid in cash. The paymaster would count out the bills while a Marine guard stood watch, and each man would sign for his money, stuff it in his pocket, and start planning how to spend it. Many headed into Honolulu for one last night of liberty. The bars and restaurants did booming business. There were parties on several of the ships, officers and enlisted men celebrating the weekend with food and music, and perhaps more alcohol than regulations strictly allowed. That same day in Washington, President Franklin Roosevelt sent a final appeal directly to Emperor Hirohito of Japan, pleading for peace. The message would not reach Hirohito until after the attack had already begun. Also that day, American code breakers intercepted and decoded a 14-part Japanese diplomatic message that was being sent to the Japanese embassy in Washington. The message was essentially a rejection of the latest American negotiating position, a clear indication that diplomacy had failed. But critically, the message itself did not declare war or warn of an attack. It was scheduled to be delivered to the American government at 1300 hours Washington time on December 7th, which was 0730 hours Hawaii time. The timing was no accident. The Japanese wanted their diplomatic rejection to be handed over just before their bombs started falling, giving a thin veneer of legality to what was about to happen. But the final part of the message wasn't decoded until early Sunday morning, and then it took time to process and deliver to senior officials. By the time anyone in Washington realized what was about to happen, it was too late to warn Pearl Harbor effectively. A message was sent, but it had to go through commercial telegraph because military communications lines were down for maintenance. The telegram warning of possible attack arrived at the Honolulu Telegraph Office at 07:33 hours, just 22 minutes before the first bomb fell. But it wasn't marked as urgent, so the delivery boy put it in his bicycle basket and started his regular rounds. He would deliver it to military headquarters at 11:45 hours, long after the attack was over, long after 2,403 Americans were dead. Think about that. While sailors were dying on the Arizona and drowning in the Oklahoma and fighting fires on the Nevada, a teenage delivery boy was pedaling his bicycle through Honolulu streets, carrying in his basket a message that might have changed everything if it had arrived even 1 hour earlier. This detail would haunt the investigations that followed. What if the telegram had been marked urgent? What if the military lines had been working? What if someone in Washington had picked up a telephone and called Pearl Harbor directly instead of relying on telegraph systems? The attack would still have happened. The Japanese fleet was already in position, the aircraft already prepared, the plan already in motion. But ships might have been at sea instead of at anchor. Aircraft might have been in the air instead of parked wingtip to wingtip. Men might have been at battle stations instead of still in their bunks. The death toll might have been hundreds instead of thousands. History turns on such small moments, such minor delays, such innocent mistakes. So as Saturday night turned into Sunday morning, Pearl Harbor slept. Men in bunks dreamed their dreams. Officers in their cabins wrote letters or read books or simply tried to get a decent night's rest. Watchstanders made their rounds, checking spaces, logging readings, noting nothing unusual. The ships sat at their moorings, massive and powerful but silent, their crews at minimal manning, their guns unloaded, their aircraft secured. The night sky above Hawaii was beautiful in those last hours before dawn, stars brilliant in the tropical darkness. The Milky Way splashed across the sky like spilled paint. No one looked up and saw the bombers coming. No one heard the drone of hundreds of engines over the sound of wind and water. The last night of peace passed into morning, and with morning came fire. Part 3. The moment the sky tore apart. You're awake now. Not quite fully awake, but that state where your eyes are open and your mind is beginning to function, and you're aware that another day has started whether you want it to or not. The red battle lanterns in the berthing compartment cast everything in crimson shadows. You can hear the breathing of 100 men around you, some still sleeping, others starting to stir. Someone's alarm clock goes off, a tinny ringing that gets quickly silenced. The man in the bunk above you shifts, making the whole stack of racks creak and sway. It's 07:50 hours. In 5 minutes, the ship's bugler will sound reveille throughout the vessel. But you're already awake, so you might as well get moving. You swing your legs out of the bunk, feet finding the deck, and stand up, careful not to bang your head on the overhead. The compartment is cramped, narrow aisles between the triple-stacked bunks, barely enough room to move without bumping into someone. You reach for your dungarees, pulling them on, then your chambray shirt. No need for dress uniform today. Sunday in port means working uniform unless you're standing a formal watch. You're heading toward the ladder that leads up to the next deck when you hear it. A sound that doesn't quite fit, doesn't quite make sense in the context of Sunday morning on a peaceful harbor. It's distant, muffled by the steel hull, but unmistakable once you notice it. The sound of aircraft engines, lots of them, growing louder. And then, underneath that sound, something else. A sharp crack, then another, then a rapid series of them. Explosions. For a moment, you're confused. Is this a drill? Some kind of exercise nobody told the crew about? But the ship's alarm hasn't sounded. There's been no warning over the loudspeakers. And those explosions sound wrong. Too loud, too violent for any training exercise you've experienced. Based on what survivors later described, these first few seconds of confusion were universal. The human mind struggling to process something so far outside normal experience that it seems unreal. Then the ship's general alarm begins its harsh clanging. The loudspeakers crackle to life, and a voice, tight with tension, announces, "Air raid Pearl Harbor. This is no drill. All hands man your battle stations." This is no drill. Those 4 words cut through the confusion like a knife. This is no drill. Men erupt from their bunks, grabbing clothes, grabbing shoes, grabbing anything that might be necessary. The berthing compartment transforms instantly from a sleepy space to organized chaos as more than 100 sailors try to move at once, all heading for different parts of the ship, all trying to get to their assigned battle stations before whatever is happening gets worse. You're a loader in turret 4, the rearmost turret on the ship, so you need to get aft and down into the ammunition handling room. But first, you need to get up this ladder and through the watertight door that leads to the next deck. Men are bunched up, pushing, shouting, the alarm still clanging, and now you can hear more sounds from above. The rapid bark of anti-aircraft guns opening fire, the shriek of aircraft engines diving, the crump of bombs hitting something, somewhere close. You make it through the door and up another ladder. Now you're on a deck with portholes, and through them you can see fire. Actual fire, orange and black smoke. Somewhere across the harbor on Ford Island, the airfield is burning, but you don't have time to stop and look because you need to get to your station. You're running now, following the route you've practiced hundreds of times in drills, through passageways and down ladders, heading deeper into the ship, toward the magazines where the big shells are stored. Outside, topside, the world has transformed into hell. Commander Fuchida's first wave of 183 aircraft arrived over Pearl Harbor at exactly 0755 hours. They came from multiple directions, the precision of their attack plan evident in how they divided their forces. 40 Kate torpedo bombers approached from the south and west, flying low over the water, heading for Battleship Row. 50 high-altitude bombers came from the east, climbing to 10,000 feet before beginning their runs on the airfields. 51 dive bombers, the Val aircraft with their distinctive fixed landing gear, screamed down from above onto specific targets. And 43 Zero fighters swept across the harbor and the airfields, strafing anything that moved, shooting up aircraft parked on the ground, clearing the way for the bombers. The first torpedo hit the USS Oklahoma at 0755 hours. The Oklahoma was moored outboard of the Maryland on the northwestern side of Ford Island, one of the most vulnerable positions in Battleship Row. The torpedo bombers came at her from the west, flying so low that their pilots could see American sailors looking up in confusion from the deck. The torpedoes had been specially modified for Pearl Harbor's shallow waters, fitted with wooden fins that kept them from diving too deep after being dropped. They hit the Oklahoma's port side in rapid succession. 1 torpedo, 2, 3, 4, 5. The Oklahoma began to list almost immediately. Water poured through the gaping holes in her hull, flooding compartments faster than damage control parties could respond. Inside the ship, men were thrown off their feet as the deck tilted. Lights went out as power failed. Watertight doors that had been dogged shut for the night suddenly became death traps, as sailors on the wrong side of them found themselves in flooding compartments with no way out. The list increased. 10 degrees, 15, 20. Men started abandoning ship, climbing up the sloping deck, jumping into the oil-slicked water of the harbor. 12 minutes after the first torpedo hit, at 0807 hours, the Oklahoma capsized completely. She rolled over onto her side, her starboard hull and propellers now pointing skyward, more than 400 men trapped inside. Some of them were still alive, huddled in air pockets, wondering if anyone would come to rescue them. 32 of them would eventually be cut out of the hull over the next 2 days. The other 429 would die there, some from injuries sustained in the attack, others from drowning, as water slowly filled every space. Still others from suffocation, as the air turned foul and oxygen ran out. The USS Arizona was struck by a different weapon. She was moored inboard of the repair ship Vestal, somewhat protected from torpedo attack, but vulnerable to bombs dropped from high altitude. At 0806 hours, just as the Oklahoma was beginning her death roll, a 1,160-pound armor-piercing bomb fell from a Kate bomber, flying at 10,000 feet. The bomb had originally been a battleship shell, modified with fins and a fuse, designed specifically to punch through armored decks. It struck the Arizona on the right side of turret 2 and penetrated deep into the ship before detonating. The explosion set off a catastrophic secondary explosion in the forward magazines, where more than 1 million pounds of gunpowder and shells were stored. The blast was so enormous that it lifted the entire front of the ship out of the water. Flames shot hundreds of feet into the air. The forward magazines, the forward engine room, everything forward of turret 3 was simply obliterated. Men on nearby ships watched in horror as pieces of the Arizona rained down across the harbor. A 1,000-pound section of the ship's armor plating landed on the repair ship Vestal. Body parts fell like rain. 1,177 men died on the Arizona. Most died instantly in the magazine explosion. Others were trapped in spaces that weren't immediately destroyed, but from which there was no escape. Still others made it into the water, only to be burned alive by the oil fires that spread across the surface of the harbor. The entire attack, from first torpedo to last bomb, lasted about 90 minutes. The Arizona was effectively dead in the first 10. On the USS Nevada, moored alone at the northern end of Battleship Row, a torpedo struck the port bow at 0755 hours, blowing a large hole in the hull. But the Nevada was one of the newest and best-designed battleships in the fleet, with extensive watertight subdivisions and modern damage control systems. Her crew reacted quickly, closing watertight doors, counter-flooding to correct the list, fighting fires. And then they did something extraordinary. They decided to get the ship underway, to make a run for the harbor entrance and get into open water where they'd have more room to maneuver and fight. Getting a battleship underway normally requires hours of preparation. Fires have to be lit in the boilers to build up steam pressure. The engine room crew has to man their stations. The deck division has to retrieve anchors and cast off mooring lines. It's a complex operation requiring careful coordination. But this wasn't normal circumstances. The Nevada's engineers managed to get enough steam pressure to move the ship in less than 15 minutes. At 0820 hours, with fires burning on her deck and bomb holes in her hull, and most of her crew still trying to reach their stations, the Nevada backed away from her berth and began moving down the channel toward the harbor entrance. She never made it. As the Nevada approached the entrance, Japanese dive bombers spotted her and recognized that if she sank in the narrow channel, she would block Pearl Harbor completely, trapping the entire Pacific Fleet. They descended on the Nevada like wolves on wounded prey. 5 bombs hit her, 6, 7. Fires erupted across the superstructure. The forward deck became a sheet of flames. Realizing that the ship was going to sink, her captain ordered her to be deliberately grounded on the shore near Hospital Point. The Nevada's bow ran up onto the mud at 0910 hours, settling there, still afloat, but out of the channel. 60 of her crew were dead or dying, but she had saved the harbor from being completely closed. The Tennessee and West Virginia were moored together, the West Virginia outboard. The Tennessee was partially protected by the West Virginia, but that protection came at a terrible cost to the other ship. The West Virginia took 7 torpedoes and 2 bombs. Her captain, Mervyn Bennion, was fatally wounded by shrapnel while standing on the bridge trying to organize the defense of his ship. And this is where one of Pearl Harbor's most extraordinary stories begins, though it would take the Navy months to fully acknowledge it. Doris Miller was a 22-year-old messman from Waco, Texas, one of hundreds of African-American sailors restricted to serving food and cleaning quarters because the Navy's racist policies wouldn't allow black men to serve in combat ratings. When general quarters sounded, Miller had been collecting laundry. He reported to his battle station, an anti-aircraft magazine that had already been destroyed. Then went to the bridge, where he found Captain Bennion mortally wounded. Miller helped move the dying captain to a safer location. Then, with no formal training on the weapon, he manned a .50 caliber Browning anti-aircraft gun and fired at the attacking Japanese planes until he ran out of ammunition. Based on the aircraft brought down in his firing zone, it's believed he shot down at least 2 planes, possibly more. When ordered to abandon ship as the West Virginia settled to the harbor bottom, Miller helped pull other sailors from the oil-covered water before swimming to Ford Island himself. The Navy initially didn't identify him in press reports about the attack, referring to him only as an unnamed Negro messman. It took sustained pressure from the black press and civil rights organizations before the Navy publicly recognized Miller's actions. In May 1942, Admiral Chester Nimitz personally awarded him the Navy Cross, the Navy's 3rd highest decoration, making Miller one of the first African Americans to receive such recognition. The citation praised his distinguished devotion to duty, extraordinary courage, and disregard for his own personal safety. But Miller's story doesn't end in heroism rewarded. He was assigned to the escort carrier USS Liscome Bay in 1943. On November 24th, during the Battle of Macon, a Japanese submarine torpedoed the Liscome Bay. The torpedo struck the bomb magazine, creating a massive explosion that broke the ship in 2 and sank her within minutes. Doris Miller, was among the 646 crew members killed. He was 24 years old. The man who had saved lives at Pearl Harbor despite a system that tried to limit his service died fighting anyway. Because courage doesn't wait for permission, and heroism doesn't require official recognition. The West Virginia settled to the harbor bottom, but remained essentially upright, saved from capsizing by quick counterflooding. But 106 of her crew were dead, and 3 men trapped in an airtight storage compartment deep within the ship would live for more than 2 weeks before finally suffocating. When salvage crews found them months later, they discovered a calendar on the wall with the dates marked off, December 7th through December 23rd. The California, at the southern end of Battleship Row, took 2 torpedoes and a bomb. She began to settle slowly, flooding from the damaged compartments, her captain trying desperately to save the ship by counterflooding and damage control. But too many compartments had been left open for the weekend routine, and water spread through the ship faster than it could be contained. She finally settled to the bottom 3 days later, submerged except for her superstructure. 98 of her crew were dead. The Pennsylvania was in dry dock and thus protected from torpedo attack, but she was hit by at least 1 bomb. The destroyers Cassin and Downs, also in dry dock near the Pennsylvania, were set on fire and eventually rolled off their blocks, falling over in tangled ruins of twisted steel. The Maryland was protected by the capsized Oklahoma, taking only 2 bomb hits and suffering relatively light damage. The Utah, an old battleship that had been converted to a target and gunnery training ship, capsized after being hit by 2 torpedoes, killing 58 of her crew. Beyond Battleship Row, chaos reigned across all of Pearl Harbor. The Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes struck the Naval Air Station on Ford Island, destroying dozens of PBY Catalina patrol planes lined up wingtip to wingtip. They hit Hickam Field, the Army Air Corps base, blowing up B-17 bombers and P-40 fighters before the American planes could even taxi to the runway. They struck Wheeler Field in the center of Oahu, catching most of its fighter planes on the ground. They attacked Kaneohe Bay Naval Air Station on the windward side of the island, destroying or damaging every aircraft stationed there. The anti-aircraft response from the American forces was fierce but disorganized. Sailors and soldiers manned whatever weapons they could reach, often without orders, often without proper ammunition, sometimes without even being sure which aircraft were enemy and which were American. But they fought. They fought with anti-aircraft guns on the ships. They fought with machine guns stripped from damaged aircraft and mounted on improvised tripods. Some fought with rifles and pistols, firing up at aircraft flying hundreds of feet overhead in a gesture that was more defiance than effectiveness. The noise was beyond description. The roar of aircraft engines, the crack of anti-aircraft fire, the deeper boom of exploding bombs and torpedoes, the shriek of diving planes, the rattle of machine gun fire, the screams of wounded men, the groan of metal as ships settled toward the bottom, the whoosh of flames, consuming everything combustible, all of this happening at once, layered on top of each other, creating a symphony of destruction that assaulted your ears and your mind. And the smoke. Black smoke from burning oil, white smoke from burning paint and wood, gray smoke from cordite and exploding shells. It rose in pillars throughout the harbor, blotting out the sun, turning morning into twilight. the smell of it acrid and chemical and organic all at once. The smell of fuel and metal and burning human flesh. Part 4. When steel burns and men drown. Down in the ammunition handling room of Turret 4 on your ship, you can't see any of this. You can hear it, muffled and distant through layers of steel. But the sounds are distorted, confusing, impossible to interpret clearly. What you can feel, though, is the ship shuddering beneath your feet. Each explosion sends vibrations through the hull, through the deck plates, up through your legs and into your chest. Big explosions feel different from small ones. A bomb hit somewhere else on the ship produces a massive concussive wave that makes your ears pop and knocks loose dust from every surface. A near miss in the water alongside creates a deep, rolling motion that makes the entire vessel heave. The ammunition handling room is organized chaos right now. Your job, along with a dozen other men, is to take the massive 1,400-pound armor-piercing shells from their storage racks and load them onto the hoists that will carry them up into the turret above. It's backbreaking work under the best circumstances. Each shell is longer than a man is tall, and even with the mechanical assists, getting them positioned properly requires strength and coordination. Under battle conditions, with the ship being attacked, with alarm bells ringing, and the battle lanterns casting everything in weird red shadows, it's almost impossible. But you do it anyway, because that's what you've trained for. The gun captain in the turret above needs ammunition if he's going to fire back at whoever is attacking you. So you and your crew muscle the shells into position, lock them onto the hoists, send them upward. Another shell, another. The routine helps keep the panic at bay. As long as you're focused on the physical task, the mechanics of loading and lifting and securing, you don't have time to think about what might be happening on the decks above you. Whether the ship is sinking, whether you're going to die down here in this steel box deep in the bowels of the vessel. The turret itself is trying to acquire targets, but it's nearly impossible. The 5-inch anti-aircraft guns are firing. You can hear their distinctive bark even through the armor of the magazine. But the main battery guns can't depress low enough to hit aircraft. They're designed to fight other ships at ranges of 10 or 15 miles, not planes a few hundred feet overhead. Still, the gun crews go through the motions, because doing something, anything, is better than just standing there helpless. The ship takes a hit. You don't know where, don't know what kind of weapon, but you know it's bad, because the entire vessel lurches sideways and the lights flicker and die. Emergency battle lanterns kick in after a moment, but the darkness in between is absolute and terrifying. Someone curses, someone else prays. You just keep working, hands moving automatically to the next shell. Because stopping means thinking, and thinking means understanding how utterly vulnerable you are right now. The communication system crackles. The voice of the officer in command of the turret comes through, distorted by static, but still intelligible. Damage control, we've got fires on the boat deck. Repair parties respond immediately. Fires, that's bad. Fire is one of the great terrors of shipboard life. In the confined spaces of a warship, fire can spread with terrifying speed, consuming everything flammable, generating smoke and toxic gases that kill as surely as flames. And you're surrounded by explosives. If fire reaches this magazine, if the temperature gets high enough to cook off a shell or a powder charge, the resulting explosion will vaporize everything within a 100-foot radius. You glance at your shipmates. Their faces show the same fear you're feeling, eyes wide, movements a little too quick, a little too jerky. But they're still working, still doing their jobs, because what else can you do? Above you, on the decks, and in the superstructure, your shipmates are fighting their own desperate battles. Damage control parties are combating fires with hoses and extinguishers, trying to stop the spread before it consumes vital spaces. Medical corpsmen are treating the wounded right where they fall, because the sick bay is overwhelmed, and there's no time to move casualties anywhere. Men with buckets are forming chains to throw water on fires when the fire hoses can't reach, or when water pressure fails. Repair crews are shoring up damaged bulkheads with timbers, trying to stop flooding from spreading through the ship. On the USS Arizona, the men who survived the initial magazine explosion are facing an impossible situation. The forward part of the ship is simply gone, replaced by a roaring inferno that's generating so much heat that men on nearby ships can feel it scorching their skin from hundreds of yards away. The fuel oil from the Arizona's ruptured tanks is spreading across the harbor surface, burning with thick black smoke, creating an oil slick that covers acres of water. Sailors who jumped overboard to escape the flames find themselves swimming through fire, the oil sticking to their skin and clothes, igniting and burning them alive. Joseph George, a boatswain's mate on the repair ship Vestal moored alongside the Arizona, sees 6 men trapped on the Arizona's mast structure as fire consumes the deck below them. The Vestal is taking damage herself, hit by the same bomb that doomed the Arizona, but George doesn't hesitate. He drags a mooring line to the rail and throws it across the gap between the two ships. The line is manila rope, about 3 inches thick, stretched between the Vestal's deck and the Arizona's mast, 30 feet above the burning water. The 6 Arizona sailors have no choice. One by one, they grab the line and hand over hand their way across, dangling above flames and smoke and certain death. All 6 make it. One of them is a 19-year-old seaman named Donald Stratton, who will carry burn scars covering more than 60% of his body for the rest of his life. He'll live to be 97 years old, one of the last survivors of the Arizona, finally dying in 2020, nearly 80 years after the attack. On the USS Oklahoma, still capsizing, the nightmare is different, but no less horrific. The ship is rolling over so gradually that at first, many men inside don't realize what's happening. The deck starts to slant. That's not unusual in rough seas or during maneuvering. But this slant gets steeper and steeper. And then suddenly you're not standing on the deck anymore. You're standing on what used to be the wall. Equipment and loose gear are tumbling, crashing into people, blocking passageways. The lights go out completely. In the absolute darkness, men are trying to find ladders that are no longer where they're supposed to be because the whole geometry of the ship has changed. Water is rising in the lower compartments. You can hear it, a rushing sound like a waterfall getting louder. Men are screaming for help, pounding on watertight doors that are now hopelessly jammed by the stress of the hull twisting. Some compartments have airlocks that might allow escape, but in the darkness and confusion and terror, men can't find them. or can't operate them, or simply don't know they exist. There's a young sailor named Stephen Bauer Young, trapped in a storage compartment near the bottom of the ship, which is now near the top since the ship has rolled over. He's with 10 other men. They have perhaps 20 feet of airspace in what used to be a much larger compartment, but most of it is now filled with water that came flooding in through various openings. In the darkness, they take turns hammering on the hull with a wrench, tapping out SOS in Morse code. They have no idea if anyone can hear them. They have no idea if anyone is even trying to rescue them. Someone is. A civilian worker at the Navy Yard named Julio de Castro heard the tapping while inspecting the capsized hull. Over the next 2 days, he and his crew will cut through the steel with acetylene torches and rescue 32 men from the Oklahoma. But they can't save everyone. Many are already dead from injuries sustained when the ship rolled over. Others are in compartments too deep to reach quickly enough. And the cutting process itself creates new dangers. Each hole they cut releases trapped air, causing water levels to rise in adjacent spaces, drowning men who might have otherwise been saved. Young and his group are fortunate. After hours of waiting in the dark, listening to the water rise, they hear the sound of cutting torches on the other side of the hull. They can see the glowing metal as the torch eats through the steel. When the hole is finally big enough, they scramble out one by one, emerging from what was certain death into Hawaii's daylight, covered in oil and water and blood, barely able to believe they're alive. Not everyone is so lucky. In the weeks and months that follow, salvage crews will find more bodies sealed in spaces throughout the capsized hull. In one compartment, they'll find 3 sailors who clearly survived for some time after the initial capsizing. There are tool marks on the bulkhead where they tried to cut their way out. There are messages scratched into the paint. The agony of those final hours, slowly suffocating or drowning in the dark, is almost too terrible to contemplate. The second wave of Japanese aircraft arrived over Pearl Harbor at 08:54 hours, just as the first wave was departing. This wave consisted of 167 aircraft, 54 Kate bombers configured for high-altitude attack, 78 Valdive bombers, and 35 Zero fighters. Their targets were primarily the ships that had survived the first wave and the military installations around the harbor. But by this time, American defenses had organized. The surprise was gone. Anti-aircraft crews were fully manned, and ammunition was broken out, and every gun that could shoot was shooting. The Japanese pilots found the second wave much more costly than the first. The sky was filled with exploding shells and tracers. Several Japanese aircraft were shot down in the first few minutes. Others were damaged and trailing smoke as they tried to complete their attack runs. The Valdive bombers were particularly vulnerable because they had to make long, straight approaches to drop their bombs accurately, exposing themselves to concentrated fire for dangerous seconds. But they pressed their attacks with the same determination they'd shown in the first wave. The destroyer Shaw, in floating dry dock, was hit by bombs that penetrated her forward magazine. The resulting explosion was captured in one of the most iconic photographs of the attack, a massive fireball erupting from the destroyer's bow, sending pieces of the ship flying in all directions. Miraculously, the Shaw would eventually be repaired and returned to service. The Pennsylvania in dry dock was hit again. The cruisers Honolulu, Cassin, and Downs all took additional damage. The Japanese pilots were looking particularly for the aircraft carriers, which were the real prizes. But here's where fate intervened in a way that would shape the entire Pacific War. All three Pacific Fleet carriers were at sea, away from Pearl Harbor on various missions. The Enterprise had been delivering aircraft to Wake Island and was scheduled to return on December 6th. But bad weather delayed her. She didn't enter Pearl Harbor until the evening of December 8th, missing the attack by a day. The Lexington was delivering aircraft to Midway Island. The Saratoga was on the west coast undergoing maintenance. The Japanese had hoped to catch all three carriers in port, delivering a knockout blow to American naval aviation. Instead, through what can only be described as extraordinary fortune, all three survived intact. This absence would prove catastrophic for Japan's long-term prospects. Those carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, would form the core of the American response in the coming months, launching the Doolittle raid on Tokyo in April 1942 and fighting the crucial battles at Coral Sea and Midway that would turn the tide of the war. If they'd been destroyed at Pearl Harbor alongside the battleships, the Pacific War would have unfolded very differently. Japan's attack succeeded tactically, but failed strategically, in part because luck, simple, random luck, kept the most valuable American warships out of harm's way. The second wave departed at 0945 hours. By 1000 hours, the last Japanese aircraft had left Oahu's airspace, formed up with their carriers, and headed northwest toward home. They left behind a scene of devastation that would have been hard to imagine just 3 hours earlier. Pearl Harbor looked like the end of the world. Black smoke rose from dozens of fires, so thick that in some places you couldn't see 50 yards. The water was covered with oil and debris and floating bodies. Ships that had been magnificent examples of American naval power were now shattered wrecks, listing or capsized or settled to the bottom, with only their superstructures showing above water. The tally of destruction was staggering. 8 battleships had been damaged or destroyed. The Arizona was a total loss, her hull broken and burned, never to sail again. The Oklahoma had capsized. The California and West Virginia had settled to the bottom. The Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania were damaged but repairable. The Nevada had been deliberately beached. 3 destroyers were sunk. 3 cruisers were damaged. Nearly 200 aircraft had been destroyed or damaged beyond repair, and 2,103 Americans were dead, with another 1,178 wounded. But the Japanese had missed critical targets. The repair facilities, the fuel storage tanks, the submarine base all remained intact. And critically, the carriers were safe. The attack had been a tactical success, but ultimately a strategic miscalculation. Years later, the 1970 film Tora 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 would have Yamamoto reflecting, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." While there's no evidence he actually spoke or wrote those exact words, the sentiment matches what we know of his thinking. In verified correspondence from January 1942, he expressed shame that Japan had struck a sleeping enemy and warned that America, angered and outraged, would launch a determined counterattack. He'd told colleagues before the attack that he could run wild for 6 months to a year, but had no expectation of success after that. He was right. The critical Battle of Midway occurred exactly 6 months later, in June 1942, marking the turning point of the Pacific War. Whether or not Yamamoto spoke the famous phrase, he understood what Japan had done, turned a reluctant giant into an implacable enemy. How Part 5, Afterward. When the guns fall silent. The silence after the attack is almost as shocking as the attack itself. For more than 2 hours, Pearl Harbor has been filled with noise, constant overwhelming noise, explosions and gunfire and engines and shouting and screaming. And then suddenly, the Japanese planes are gone. The anti-aircraft guns fall quiet, and there's this strange, ringing silence, broken only by the crackle of fires and the cries of wounded men and the creaking of damaged ships settling into the harbor mud. You emerge from the magazine room, climbing up through the ship, and the first thing that hits you is the smell. It's not just smoke, though there's plenty of that. It's something more complex and more terrible, a mixture of burning oil and hot metal and burnt paint, and another smell underneath it all that you recognize on some primal level as burning flesh. You've never smelled anything like it before, and you'll never forget it for the rest of your life. When you reach the upper deck, the scene is almost incomprehensible. The harbor you know has been transformed. Where there used to be neat rows of battleships at their moorings, there's now chaos. Ships are listing, burning, settling into the mud. The Arizona is barely recognizable, her superstructure a twisted wreck still belching flames and black smoke. The Oklahoma is completely capsized, her red bottom paint showing above the water, her propellers pointing at the sky. The water itself is covered with oil, thick rainbow sheens that catch the light, and floating debris and bodies. Bodies everywhere, some floating in the water, some sprawled on the decks, some trapped in the wreckage. Some are clearly dead, torn apart by shrapnel or burned beyond recognition. Others are wounded, crying for help, trying to swim through the oil toward rescue boats. The medical situation is overwhelming. The base hospital was designed to handle maybe 50 casualties at a time. It's now receiving hundreds. Doctors and nurses are performing surgery on mess tables, on desks, on the floor, anywhere they can lay a wounded man down. They're running out of blood plasma, out of morphine, out of bandages. Civilian doctors and nurses from Honolulu are streaming onto the base to help. But there's simply too much trauma, too many wounds, too much death. The first priority is rescue. Motor launches are moving through the harbor, pulling survivors from the water. Sailors from ships that weren't badly damaged are forming rescue parties, rowing small boats through the oil and debris, fishing out men who are too burned or too weak to swim to safety. It's dangerous work. Some fires are still burning on the water's surface, and the oil makes everything slippery and treacherous. But men do it anyway, because those are their shipmates in the water, and you don't leave shipmates behind. On the capsized Oklahoma, rescue crews are using acetylene torches to cut through the hull, trying to reach men trapped inside. It's delicate work. Cut in the wrong place, and you might accidentally kill the men you're trying to save. Cut too slowly and they'll suffocate before you can reach them. The rescuers can hear tapping from inside the hull. Morse code messages hammered out with wrenches. SOS signals that are growing weaker as hours pass and oxygen runs low in the sealed compartments. Julio de Castro and his civilian crew work for 36 hours straight, barely stopping to eat or rest, cutting hole after hole in the Oklahoma's hull. Each time they break through, they never know what they'll find. Sometimes it's a compartment full of water and corpses. Sometimes it's living men, oil-covered and terrified, but alive. 32 men are pulled out alive over 2 days. It's a miracle that any survived at all, given how completely the ship capsized. On the West Virginia, tapping sounds continue from deep within the hull for 16 days after the attack. Think about that for a moment. While America is declaring war, while rescue operations wind down, while life begins to move forward, 3 men are still alive inside the sunken ship, trapped in an airtight compartment, slowly running out of air and hope. Rescue crews try desperately to reach the source of the tapping, but the damage is too extensive, the path too dangerous, the risk of causing further flooding too high. The tapping finally stops on December 23rd, 16 days of darkness, of rationing whatever food and water might have been stored in that compartment, of taking turns sleeping to conserve oxygen, of keeping each other sane by talking about home, about families, about the future they'd probably never see. When the West Virginias eventually raised months later, salvage crews discover the truth. 3 sailors in an airtight storage compartment, Ronald Endicott, Clifford Olds, and Lewis Costin. They find a calendar on the wall with dates marked off in red pencil, December 7th through December 23rd. 16 days. 16 days of waiting for rescue that never came, of hope gradually turning to acceptance, of dying by inches in the dark, while the world moved on without them. This is what Pearl Harbor means, beyond the statistics and the strategic analyses. It means men dying slowly over 16 days, while America fights a war to avenge them. It means bodies never recovered, families never getting closure, questions never answered about what those final moments were like. The dead outnumber the survivors. Bodies are being recovered from the water, from the wreckage, from spaces throughout the damaged ships. Each body has to be identified if possible, photographed, fingerprinted, given some dignity in death, even though the circumstances of their dying were anything but dignified. The morgue at the hospital is overwhelmed almost immediately. Temporary morgues are set up in warehouses, in parking lots, in any space large enough to lay out rows of bodies. Identification is often impossible. Many bodies are burned beyond recognition. Others are so badly torn apart by explosions that they're more fragments than corpses. Dog tags help when they can be found, but not everyone was wearing their tags when the attack hit. Dental records help for some, but the Navy's dental records are incomplete. Eventually, many men will be buried as unknowns, their families receiving telegrams that say only that their son or husband was killed in action at Pearl Harbor, details unknown. The base is in a state of organized chaos as commanders try to figure out what just happened and prepare for what might happen next. There's a very real fear that the Japanese attack was just the prelude to an invasion. No one knows where the Japanese carriers are. They could be positioning for a second strike. They could be covering an amphibious landing force. The Army immediately establishes martial law across Hawaii, bringing civilian life under military control. Blackouts are instituted. Civilians are told to stay off the streets. Roadblocks are set up. Machine gun nests are positioned at key points. The paranoia about Japanese saboteurs and fifth columnists reaches absurd heights. The large Japanese-American population on Oahu falls under immediate suspicion, despite the fact that not a single act of sabotage has been committed by any Japanese American. Hundreds will be rounded up in the coming weeks and months, held in internment camps, their loyalty questioned simply because of their ethnicity. It's one of the darker aspects of America's response to the attack, fear and racism overriding logic and justice. Meanwhile, salvage operations begin almost immediately. The Navy's salvage experts survey the damage and start making plans. Some ships are obviously beyond repair. The Arizona is too broken, too burned. She'll be left where she sank, eventually becoming a memorial. The Utah, old and less valuable, will also be left. But the others, even those that seem completely destroyed, will be raised and repaired if at all possible. America needs every ship it can get, and the industrial capacity to repair damaged vessels is more readily available than the capacity to build new ones from scratch. The Oklahoma presents the most difficult salvage challenge. She's completely upside down, settled into the harbor mud, more than 30,000 tons of ship in completely the wrong orientation. But Navy engineers develop an ingenious plan. They'll attach enormous concrete and steel uprighting structures to the exposed bottom of the ship, then use electric winches to slowly rotate the hull, degree by degree, until it's upright again. It will take over a year, but it will work. The Oklahoma will be raised, pumped out, and towed to the mainland. She'll never be repaired enough to fight again, but the salvage operation itself will be a testament to American engineering and determination. The West Virginia, California, and Nevada will all be raised, repaired, and returned to service. They'll fight in battles across the Pacific, their crews motivated by a burning desire for revenge against the nation that tried to destroy them. The Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, less heavily damaged, will be repaired relatively quickly and back in action within months. On December 8th, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt addresses a joint session of Congress. His speech is brief, just over 6 minutes, but every word is carefully chosen. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. His voice is firm, controlled, carrying both the weight of the tragedy and the resolve of the nation. He recounts the facts of the attack, the death toll, the damage. And then he makes his request. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire. The vote is swift and nearly unanimous. Only one member of Congress votes against the declaration of war, Representative Janetta Rankin of Montana, a pacifist who had also voted against American entry into World War I. Within an hour of Roosevelt's speech, America is officially at war with Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy, Japan's allies in the Tripartite Pact, will declare war on the United States. America is now fully committed to fighting a two-ocean war against both Japan in the Pacific and the Axis powers in Europe and Africa. The American public's reaction to Pearl Harbor is one of shock, followed quickly by fury. The idea that Japan had attacked while diplomatic negotiations were still ongoing, that the Japanese ambassador had been presenting peace proposals in Washington, even as Japanese planes were bombing American ships, strikes Americans as the height of treachery. Remember Pearl Harbor becomes a rallying cry. Recruitment offices are overwhelmed with men wanting to enlist. Women are volunteering for war work in factories. The entire nation is mobilizing with a speed and unity that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. But for the survivors at Pearl Harbor, the immediate days after the attack are focused on more mundane concerns. Cleaning up, burying the dead, assessing damage, beginning repairs, trying to figure out what happened and why they weren't better prepared. The sense of shock hasn't worn off yet. You keep expecting to wake up and find it was all a nightmare. But every morning you wake up and the destroyed ships are still there, and the smell of smoke is still in the air, and the lists of the dead keep getting longer. You attend memorial services for your shipmates. There are so many funerals that they blur together. The honor guards firing volleys over flag-draped coffins, the buglers playing taps, the prayers spoken by chaplains who are themselves struggling with questions about how God could allow such horror. You fold flags and hand them to weeping widows and mothers who came to Hawaii to be with their sailor husbands and sons, and now face the prospect of going home with only a folded flag and a telegram from the Navy Department expressing regret. The days turn into weeks. Christmas comes, but there's no celebration. How can you celebrate when so many are dead? When the war is just beginning? When you know that more men will die in the years to come? You exchange small gifts with your shipmates, cigarettes and candy bars, tokens of friendship and solidarity. You write letters home trying to explain what happened without being too graphic, without revealing military information that the censors would cut out anyway, without worrying your family more than they're already worried. And gradually, you start to move forward. The fleet begins to reconstitute itself. Ships that survive the attack with minor damage leave Pearl Harbor to patrol the Pacific, to escort convoys, to begin the long process of taking the war to Japan. New ships arrive from the mainland, fresh from shipyards, to replace those that were lost. The airfields are repaired, new aircraft brought in. The base becomes a hive of activity, everyone working overtime, preparing for the next phase of the war. You don't know it yet, but Pearl Harbor will serve as the primary American base in the Pacific for the next 4 years. The facilities that the Japanese failed to destroy, the fuel tanks, the repair shops, the submarine base, will prove crucial to American offensive operations. Ships will come here to refuel, rearm, and repair between battles. Submarines will sortie from here to hunt Japanese shipping. The harbor that was a scene of defeat on December 7th will become a launching point for victory, but that's in the future. Right now, in the immediate aftermath, you're still trying to process what happened. You survived. That fact alone seems miraculous when you think about how many didn't. You keep thinking about the men you knew who are gone now. The guy who slept in the bunk above yours, killed when a bomb hit the berthing compartment. The chief petty officer who taught you your job, dead in the magazine explosion. The friend you made during boot camp, drowned when his ship capsized. Each name is a weight on your heart. You also think about the men you saw die, and those memories are the hardest. The sailor on fire, running across the deck screaming, until someone tackled him and smothered the flames, but it was already too late. The man floating face down in the oil-covered water, his body bobbing gently with each wave, and you couldn't tell if he was dead or unconscious or just too exhausted to move. The sound of men screaming inside a sealed compartment as the ship settled deeper and water rose around them. And there was nothing you could do. Nothing anyone could do except listen to the screaming gradually fade to silence. These images will stay with you. They'll come back in quiet moments when you're trying to sleep or when you're not paying attention and your mind wanders. Years later, long after the war is over, you'll still dream about them sometimes. The therapists in later decades will have a name for it: post-traumatic stress disorder. But in 1941, that terminology doesn't exist yet. You're just expected to tough it out, to be a man, to not talk about the things that bother you. So you bury it deep, lock it away, and try not to think about it. The Navy needs you functional, not traumatized. There's a war to fight, and you're part of the fighting force. So you compartmentalize your emotions the same way the ship compartmentalizes its spaces with watertight doors and bulkheads. You do your job, you stand your watches, you train for the next battle, you move forward because that's all you can do. Part 6. The Architects of Destruction, Japan's Path to War. To understand why Pearl Harbor happened, you have to go back years, even decades. The attack wasn't a sudden impulse or a desperate act, born of immediate necessity. It was the culmination of a long chain of decisions, miscalculations, and escalating tensions between two Pacific powers that had been on a collision course for most of a generation. Japan in the early 20th century was a nation transforming itself with breathtaking speed. For centuries, Japan had been isolated, closed to outside contact, except for limited trade through a single port. Then in 1853, American Commodore Matthew Perry arrived with his black ships, modern steam-powered warships that demonstrated Japan's technological backwardness in the starkest possible terms. Perry demanded that Japan open itself to trade and diplomatic relations. Japan, realizing it couldn't resist Western military power, agreed. What followed was the Meiji Restoration, a period of rapid modernization that saw Japan remake itself from a feudal society into an industrial power in just a few decades. The Japanese studied Western technology, Western military organization, Western governmental systems. They built railroads, factories, a modern army and navy. By 1905, Japan was strong enough to defeat Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, the first time an Asian power had defeated a European power in modern warfare. It was a shocking development that made the Western powers take notice of Japan as a serious player on the world stage. But Japan had a fundamental problem: resources. The Japanese islands are small and lack significant natural resources. There's no oil, very little coal, no rubber-limited iron ore. To build an industrial economy, to support a modern military, Japan needed access to resources from outside its borders. This need for resources would drive Japanese foreign policy for the next 4 decades, leading eventually to aggressive expansion across Asia and ultimately to war with the United States. Japan began its expansion by taking control of Korea in 1910, then expanding into Manchuria in 1931. The international community condemned these actions, but took no concrete steps to stop them. Emboldened, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China in 1937, starting what would become an 8-year conflict that would kill millions of Chinese civilians and soldiers. The brutality of the Japanese occupation, including atrocities like the rape of Nanking, shocked the world and began to turn international opinion decisively against Japan. The United States watched Japan's expansion with growing concern. American policy in Asia had traditionally supported China and opposed any single power dominating the region. Japanese aggression threatened not just China, but all of Southeast Asia, including European colonial possessions like French Indochina, British Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. If Japan gained control of those resource-rich areas, they would become completely independent of Western influence and a major threat to the balance of power in the Pacific. The American response was primarily economic. The United States began imposing sanctions on Japan, first restricting exports of certain strategic materials, then expanding the restrictions to include oil. This was devastating for Japan because the United States was supplying about 80% of Japan's oil imports. Without American oil, the Japanese military machine would grind to a halt within months. The Japanese had strategic oil reserves, but those would only last a year or two at most. This created a dilemma for Japanese leadership. They could either give in to American demands, withdraw from China and Indochina, give up their imperial ambitions, or they could seek alternative sources of oil. The only realistic alternative was the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, which had significant oil fields. But seizing the Dutch East Indies would mean war not just with the Netherlands, but almost certainly with Britain and the United States as well. In 1940, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, formally allying itself with the Axis powers. This was partly ideological, a shared belief in militarism and expansion, but mostly practical. Japan hoped that an alliance with Germany, which was conquering Europe at the time, would deter the United States and Britain from interfering with Japanese expansion in Asia. The calculation was that America wouldn't want to fight a two-ocean war against both Germany and Japan simultaneously. This calculation would prove spectacularly wrong, but it seemed logical at the time. And it led to the final series of escalating tensions in 1941. In July, Japan occupied southern Indochina, positioning itself to threaten both the Dutch East Indies and British Malaya. The United States responded by freezing all Japanese assets in America and implementing a complete oil embargo. This was the final straw for Japan. Without oil, their military couldn't function. They had to either submit to American demands or fight. The Japanese military leadership chose to fight, but they understood that they couldn't win a long war against the United States. America's industrial capacity was simply too great. If the war dragged on for years, America could outbuild and overwhelm Japan through sheer material superiority. Japan's only chance was to strike fast, hit hard, knock out American naval power in the Pacific, and then negotiate a peace settlement before America could fully mobilize. This is where Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto enters the picture. Yamamoto was a fascinating and contradictory figure. He had studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington. He knew America well and had a realistic assessment of its strength. Unlike many of his military colleagues, he didn't underestimate the United States. He had told colleagues that attacking America was a mistake, that Japan couldn't win a long war against such a powerful nation. When asked about his prospects for success, he reportedly said he could run wild for 6 months to a year. But after that, he had utterly no confidence. But Yamamoto was also a professional naval officer who followed orders. Once the decision to go to war was made, he threw himself into planning the best possible campaign. And he had an idea, a bold and risky idea that went against traditional Japanese naval doctrine. Instead of waiting for the Americans to bring their fleet across the Pacific and then fighting a defensive battle near Japanese waters, Yamamoto proposed launching a preemptive strike against the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, destroy the American battleships before they could put to sea, buy Japan time to conquer the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, and then fight from a position of strength rather than weakness. The plan was controversial within the Japanese military. Many senior officers thought it was too risky, that the carriers could be discovered and destroyed before they reached Hawaii, that the attack would fail and waste Japan's precious naval resources. But Yamamoto used his considerable prestige and even threatened to resign if the plan wasn't approved. Eventually, the Naval General Staff gave in, and the Pearl Harbor operation received official sanction. The planning was meticulous. Captain Minoru Genda, one of Yamamoto's most trusted subordinates, worked out the details over many months. They studied the British torpedo bomber attack on the Italian naval base at Taranto in November 1940, noting how carrier-based aircraft could successfully attack ships in harbor. They developed special torpedoes fitted with wooden fins that would run shallow enough to work in Pearl Harbor's relatively shallow waters. They modified armor-piercing bombs from battleship shells that could penetrate the thick deck armor of American battleships. They practiced relentlessly. Pilots trained at Kagoshima Bay in southern Japan, chosen because its geography resembled Pearl Harbor, a city surrounded by mountains with a harbor entrance that required flying over high terrain and then dropping down quickly to attack altitude. They flew mock attack runs again and again until every pilot knew exactly what he was supposed to do. They conducted tabletop exercises, war games, discussions of every possible contingency, and they maintained absolute secrecy. The attack plan was known only to a handful of senior officers. Even the pilots weren't told their actual target until the task force was already at sea. Ships maintained radio silence during the voyage, preventing American radio intercepts from tracking their movements. The task force took a northern route across the Pacific, passing through areas where merchant shipping was sparse, and the chances of being spotted were minimal. The Japanese carrier task force left its assembly point in Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands on November 26, 1941. It consisted of 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, plus 2 fast battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 9 destroyers, 8 tankers, and several submarines. It was the most powerful concentration of carrier power ever assembled up to that point, and it would remain undetected throughout its 3,500-mile journey across the Northern Pacific. The task force was under orders to turn back if discovered, or if diplomatic negotiations suddenly produced a breakthrough. But neither happened. The negotiations in Washington between Secretary of State Cordell Hull and Japanese diplomats continued throughout November, but they were making no progress. The American demands that Japan withdraw from China and Indochina were non-negotiable for the Japanese military. The Japanese demands that America lift the oil embargo and stop supporting China were non-negotiable for the Roosevelt administration. Both sides talked, but neither was prepared to make the concessions necessary for peace. On December 2nd, Yamamoto sent the final order to the task force: climb Mount Nitaka. It was the coded message, meaning that the attack was definitely on, that there would be no last-minute cancellation, that the fleet should proceed to its launch point north of Hawaii. On December 6th, the carriers reached their position 230 miles north of Oahu. The seas were rough, making it difficult to prepare the aircraft, but the poor weather also meant they were unlikely to be spotted by American reconnaissance planes. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, chosen to lead the first wave of attackers, later wrote about the tension that night as pilots and crews prepared for the next morning's mission. Some men wrote letters home, to be mailed if they didn't return. Others sharpened their personal items, adjusting equipment one final time. The carrier crews painted large rising sun insignias on the aircraft, making them clearly identifiable as Japanese. Anti-aircraft ammunition was loaded. Bombs and torpedoes were carefully positioned for arming. Everything had to be perfect because there would be no second chance. At 0600 hours on December 7th, in the pre-dawn darkness, with carrier decks pitching in heavy swells, the first wave launched. 183 aircraft roared off the decks, formed up in the gray light and headed south. Fuchida was in the lead plane monitoring radio frequencies, listening for any sign that they'd been detected. He heard only routine traffic from Honolulu radio stations playing music. The Americans had no idea what was coming. The irony is that Japanese diplomats in Washington were supposed to deliver a message breaking off negotiations at 1300 hours Washington time, which was 0730 hours Hawaii time, giving at least a thin veneer of legitimacy to the attack. But the message was in code and had to be decrypted and typed by embassy staff who were slow workers. The final version wasn't delivered until 1420 hours Washington time, well after the attack had already begun. So even the diplomatic cover the Japanese had planned fell through, making the attack appear even more treacherous than intended. Here, Part 7. America transformed. From isolation to total war. The America that woke up on December 8, 1941, was fundamentally different from the America that had gone to sleep on December 6th. In the space of one Sunday morning, the nation's entire relationship with the rest of the world had been transformed. The isolationism that had characterized American foreign policy for the previous 2 decades, the deep resistance to involvement in foreign wars, the sentiment that Europe's and Asia's conflicts were not America's concern, all of that evaporated in the flames of Pearl Harbor. For years, President Roosevelt had been trying to prepare the nation for the likelihood of war. He'd watched Hitler's Germany conquer most of Europe. He'd seen Japan's brutal expansion across China. He understood that the Axis powers represented a genuine threat, not just to other nations, but to the fundamental values that America claimed to stand for: democracy, freedom, human rights. But the American public didn't want to hear it. The trauma of World War I was still fresh in memory. More than 100,000 Americans had died in that conflict, and many people felt that those deaths had accomplished nothing, that America had been dragged into a European power struggle that wasn't its concern. The isolationist movement in America was strong and well organized. Groups like the America First Committee had hundreds of thousands of members who believed that America should focus on its own problems, should stay out of foreign entanglements, should let Europe and Asia sort out their own issues. Even many people who opposed Hitler's actions didn't want America to go to war over it. The sentiment was that Germany and Japan were problems for Europeans and Asians to deal with, not Americans. Roosevelt had worked around the edges of this isolationism. He'd provided aid to Britain through the Lend-Lease program, sending weapons and supplies to help them resist Germany. He'd imposed economic sanctions on Japan to try to curb their expansion. He'd been building up American military forces, expanding the Navy, drafting soldiers, increasing production of weapons and equipment. But he'd been constrained by public opinion and congressional resistance. He couldn't take America into war without overwhelming public support, and that support simply didn't exist before Pearl Harbor. The attack changed everything overnight. The Japanese hadn't just attacked a military base in a faraway territory. They'd attacked Americans, killed Americans, destroyed American property. The sneak nature of the attack, the fact that it came while peace negotiations were still ongoing, struck most Americans as dishonorable and cowardly. Overnight, isolationism collapsed. Americans who had been arguing against involvement in foreign wars were now lining up at recruitment offices, demanding to be allowed to fight. The change in public sentiment was total and immediate. Newspapers across the country published extra editions on December 7th. Headlines screaming about the attack. Radio stations interrupted regular programming with news bulletins. The next day, Americans gathered around radios to hear Roosevelt's address to Congress, more than 80% of the adult population tuning in. It was the largest radio audience in American history up to that point. And when Roosevelt concluded by asking Congress to declare war on Japan, the response was thunderous applause. The congressional vote for war was 82-0 in the Senate and 388-1 in the House. The lone dissenting vote came from Representative Jeannette Rankin of Montana, a committed pacifist who had also voted against American entry into World War I. Her vote took remarkable courage. She was booed on the House floor and had to be escorted from the Capitol by police to protect her from angry crowds. But she stuck to her principles, saying, "As a woman, I can't go to war, and I refuse to send anyone else." 3 days later, on December 11th, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, honoring their alliance with Japan. This was actually a relief for Roosevelt in some ways, because it solved his dilemma about how to justify entering the war in Europe. Hitler made the decision for him. Congress immediately declared war on Germany and Italy as well. America was now committed to fighting a global war on two fronts, something that would have been politically impossible just days earlier. The speed of American mobilization was breathtaking. Recruitment offices were overwhelmed with volunteers. In the first month after Pearl Harbor, more than 600,000 men enlisted in the Army, Navy, and Marines. Women volunteered for the new military auxiliary services, the WACs, the WAVES, the SPARs, and for war work in factories and shipyards. The production of civilian automobiles was halted entirely, with all automotive manufacturing capacity shifted to producing trucks, tanks, and military vehicles. Entire industries were converted to war production overnight. The draft was expanded massively. Before Pearl Harbor, the military draft had been controversial, barely passing Congress in 1940, renewed in August 1941 by a single vote. After Pearl Harbor, draft calls were massively increased, and there was no political opposition. Men aged 18 to 45 were required to register. Eventually, over 10 million men would be drafted during the war, and another 6 million would volunteer. The home front transformed as well. Rationing was implemented for strategic materials and food items. Gasoline, tires, meat, sugar, butter, coffee, and many other goods were rationed using a coupon system. Victory gardens were encouraged, with millions of American families planting vegetable gardens to supplement their food supply and reduce pressure on commercial farming. Scrap drives collected metal, rubber, and other materials that could be recycled for war production. Even cooking grease was collected and turned in because it could be used to make explosives. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. With millions of men in uniform, factories and shipyards needed workers. Women took jobs that had traditionally been closed to them, working as welders, riveters, machine operators, even airplane pilots, ferrying aircraft from factories to bases. Rosie the Riveter became the iconic symbol of women's contribution to the war effort, representing the millions of women who kept American industry running while the men were overseas. The war economy boomed. Unemployment, which had remained stubbornly high throughout the 1930s despite New Deal programs, essentially disappeared. Anyone who wanted a job could find one. Wages increased. People who had struggled through the Depression suddenly had money in their pockets. Of course, much of that money went to war bonds, another form of funding the war effort, with massive publicity campaigns encouraging Americans to buy bonds to support the troops. But there were also darker aspects to America's response. The attack on Pearl Harbor, carried out by Japan, led to widespread fear and suspicion of anyone of Japanese ancestry, even American citizens. Within weeks, there were calls to round up Japanese Americans on the West Coast and move them inland, away from strategic areas. In February 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the military to designate exclusion zones from which anyone could be removed for reasons of military necessity. What followed was one of the most shameful episodes in American history. Over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of them American citizens, were forcibly removed from their homes on the West Coast and imprisoned in internment camps scattered across desolate areas of the interior West. They were given little notice, forced to sell their homes and businesses at fire sale prices, and transported to camps where they lived in tar paper barracks, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. There was no due process, no formal charges, no evidence of disloyalty. They were imprisoned solely because of their ethnicity. The irony is that there was never a single verified case of espionage or sabotage by Japanese Americans either before or during the war. The people who were interned were loyal Americans, and many of their sons served in the U.S. military during the war, fighting with extraordinary distinction. The 452nd Regimental Combat Team, composed almost entirely of Japanese Americans, became the most decorated unit in U.S. military history for its size and length of service. But their families remained imprisoned while they fought. Meanwhile, in Hawaii, where Japanese Americans made up nearly 40% of the population and were essential to the economy, mass internment was deemed impractical. Only about 2,000 people were interned from Hawaii, mostly community leaders who were suspected, usually without evidence, of having special loyalty to Japan. The rest of the Japanese American population in Hawaii remained free and continued their normal lives, undermining the entire premise that Japanese Americans were a security threat. The war also accelerated social changes that had been building for decades. African Americans had long faced discrimination and segregation, including in the military. Before Pearl Harbor, the Navy restricted black sailors to messman positions. The Army maintained segregated units. But the war created pressure for change. The story of Doris Miller, the messman on the USS West Virginia, who had manned an anti-aircraft gun and shot down at least 2 Japanese planes, despite having no training on the weapon, was widely publicized. He was awarded the Navy Cross, the Navy's second highest decoration, and became a poster boy for Navy recruitment. The publicity around Miller's heroism made it harder for the Navy to justify its discriminatory policies. Gradually, grudgingly, the military began to integrate. It was a slow process. The military wouldn't be fully integrated until after the war, when President Truman issued an executive order in 1948. But the war started the process. African Americans served with distinction in segregated units, including the famous Tuskegee Airmen, proving that they were just as capable as white servicemen when given the opportunity. For the survivors of Pearl Harbor, watching America transform itself for war was both inspiring and frustrating. Inspiring because they could see the nation rallying behind them, see the determination to avenge the attack and win the war. But frustrating because they knew what war really meant in a way that most Americans didn't yet understand. They'd seen friends die, they'd pulled bodies from wreckage, they'd smelled burning flesh and heard men screaming as they burned or drowned. They knew that all the patriotic speeches and recruitment posters were leading millions of young Americans toward experiences that would scar them for life. There was also frustration about the failures that had led to Pearl Harbor being caught by surprise. As information about what had happened began to come out, it became clear that there had been warning signs that were missed or ignored. The radar sighting of incoming aircraft that was dismissed, the submarine sightings that weren't taken seriously, the intelligence intercepts that pointed toward an attack, but weren't shared with commanders at Pearl Harbor, the inadequate defensive preparations, the aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip, the ammunition locked away, the absence of long-range patrols. Multiple investigations were conducted, both during and after the war, trying to figure out who was responsible for the lack of preparedness. Admiral Kimmel and General Short, the commanders at Pearl Harbor, were relieved of duty within days of the attack. A presidential commission investigated and found both of them guilty of errors of judgment, though they also faulted Washington for not providing adequate intelligence. Kimmel and Short spent the rest of their lives trying to clear their names, arguing that they had been made scapegoats for failures at higher levels of command. The truth is probably that there was enough blame to go around. Commanders in Hawaii made mistakes. Commanders in Washington made mistakes. The intelligence community failed to put together a complete picture from the fragments of information they had. The military's peacetime culture of complacency led to inadequate defensive measures. Nobody expected an attack on Pearl Harbor because it seemed too difficult, too risky for the Japanese. But difficult and risky doesn't mean impossible. And the Japanese pulled it off because they were willing to take risks that American commanders didn't think they'd take. In the end, the question of who was responsible for Pearl Harbor mattered less than how America responded. And the response was total commitment to winning the war. The attack united the nation in a way that nothing else could have. It gave American entry into World War II a clear moral justification. Americans weren't fighting to preserve European empires or to maintain a balance of power in Asia. They were fighting because they had been attacked, because American servicemen had been killed, because the nation's honor demanded it. The phrase, "Remember Pearl Harbor," became a rallying cry that would echo throughout the war. It appeared on posters, in songs, in speeches. Workers in factories painted it on bombs and shells. Sailors painted it on ships. It represented both grief for what was lost and determination to avenge it. Pearl Harbor became the emotional core of America's war effort, the thing that kept the nation unified, even through the difficult years ahead. Part 8. Legacies Written in Water and Steel. The USS Arizona still sits on the bottom of Pearl Harbor, right where she sank on December 7, 1941. Her superstructure was cut away during salvage operations, but her hull remains, a massive steel grave for the 1,177 men who died aboard her. She still bleeds. Even today, more than 80 years later, a thin sheen of oil rises to the surface from her ruptured fuel tanks, about a quart a day, creating rainbow patterns on the water. Some call these the Tears of the Arizona, a memorial that maintains itself, that continues to remind visitors that this was a place where men died. The USS Arizona Memorial was dedicated in 1962, a white structure spanning the sunken hull without touching it, accessible by boat from the visitor center on shore. More than 2 million people visit every year, walking through the memorial, looking down at the visible remains of the ship beneath the water, reading the names of the dead inscribed on marble walls. It's become one of the most powerful war memorials in America, a place that makes the abstract concept of sacrifice concrete and immediate. There are other memorials at Pearl Harbor. The USS Oklahoma Memorial on Ford Island, dedicated in 2007, consists of white marble columns, each column representing one of the Oklahoma's crew who died. The USS Utah Memorial is less visited, but no less moving, accessible only to military personnel, marking the site where the Utah still lies, capsized and forgotten by most people. though not by the Navy, that still remembers its dead. The survivors of Pearl Harbor formed the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association in 1958, an organization dedicated to preserving the memory of the attack and supporting fellow survivors. For decades, they held annual reunions, gathering at Pearl Harbor on December 7th to remember their shipmates and their shared experience. They visited schools, gave talks, wrote memoirs, trying to ensure that younger generations would know what happened and why it mattered. But time is relentless. The youngest sailors at Pearl Harbor in 1941 were 17 or 18 years old. By the 21st century, they were in their 80s and 90s. The number of survivors dwindled each year. The annual reunions grew smaller. The Pearl Harbor Survivors Association held its final convention in 2011, on the 70th anniversary of the attack, acknowledging that there were too few members left to maintain the organization. In 2021, on the 80th anniversary, only a handful of survivors were still alive, most too frail to travel to Hawaii for the ceremony. Lou Conter, the last surviving crew member of the USS Arizona, passed away in April 2024 at the age of 102. His death marked the end of a direct living connection to the ship that has become the symbol of Pearl Harbor. The other survivors from different ships are nearly all gone now. Soon, within a few years at most, the last survivor will die, and Pearl Harbor will transition from living memory to historical event, something we know only from documents and recordings and the stories passed down. But the impact of Pearl Harbor extends far beyond the memories of those who were there. The attack fundamentally shaped the course of World War II and, by extension, the entire trajectory of the 20th century. Without Pearl Harbor, American entry into the war would have been delayed, possibly by years. Britain might have fallen. The Soviet Union might have been defeated. The Holocaust might have killed even more millions than it did. The atomic bomb might never have been developed, or it might have been developed by Nazi Germany first. Alternative history is always speculation, but it's clear that Pearl Harbor was a pivotal moment that changed everything. The attack also had profound effects on how America thinks about national security and military preparedness. No more Pearl Harbors became a guiding principle of American defense policy. Intelligence gathering was massively expanded. The CIA was created in 1947 specifically to prevent future intelligence failures. Forward deployment of military forces became standard, with American bases established around the world to ensure that any attack on American interests could be met immediately rather than requiring months of mobilization. The entire Cold War strategy of containment and deterrence was built on lessons learned from Pearl Harbor about the dangers of being unprepared. The phrase, "a Pearl Harbor attack," entered the language as shorthand for a devastating surprise attack, a catastrophic failure of intelligence and preparedness. It was invoked after 9/11, which was immediately compared to Pearl Harbor as a surprise attack on American soil that killed thousands. The comparison wasn't entirely apt. One was a military attack on a military target, the other was a terrorist attack on civilians. But the emotional resonance was similar: shock, horror, anger, and determination to respond with overwhelming force. The salvage operations at Pearl Harbor were a remarkable achievement that tends to be overshadowed by the drama of the attack itself. Between December 1941 and the end of the war in 1945, Navy salvage teams managed to refloat and repair nearly every ship that was damaged. The Nevada, California, West Virginia, Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania all returned to service and fought in the Pacific Campaign. The process required innovation, determination, and thousands of hours of dangerous work. Divers had to enter flooded, damaged ships, patch holes, shore up bulkheads, pump out water, cut away twisted metal, all while risking their lives in confined spaces filled with oil and debris and sometimes unexploded ordnance. The salvage of the Oklahoma was particularly impressive. It took from March 1943 to June 1943 to right the capsized ship, using 21 electric winches anchored to Ford Island, pulling cables attached to massive concrete pedestals that had been secured to the ship's hull. The entire operation was unprecedented in scale and ambition. Once upright, the Oklahoma was pumped out, but she was too damaged to be economically repaired. She was decommissioned in 1904 and sold for scrap in 1946. While being towed to the mainland, she broke loose in a storm and sank 500 miles northeast of Hawaii, a final indignity for a ship that had survived so much. The men who survived Pearl Harbor went on to serve throughout the war. Some remained in Hawaii, helping with the massive expansion of the base that turned it into the primary staging area for the Pacific Campaign. Others went on to fight in the major battles: Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. They brought with them a burning desire for revenge against Japan, a personal motivation that made them fierce and determined fighters. Donald Stratton, who escaped from the burning Arizona by hand-overhanding across a line to the Vestal, recovered from his burns and returned to active duty, serving on the destroyer USS Stack. He fought in multiple battles, survived the war, and lived until 2020, becoming one of the last survivors of the Arizona. He wrote a memoir, All the Gallant Men, detailing his experiences and honoring his shipmates who didn't make it. Doris Miller, the messman turned hero, was awarded the Navy Cross and became a poster boy for Navy recruitment, touring the country and appearing at war bond rallies. He was eventually promoted to cook third class. Not much of a promotion, but more than most black sailors received at that time. He was assigned to the escort carrier USS Liscome Bay. On November 24, 1943, during the Battle of Macon, the Liscome Bay was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. The torpedo hit the ship's bomb magazine, causing a massive explosion that broke the ship in two and sank her within minutes. Miller was among the 646 crew members killed. He was 24 years old. The lessons of Pearl Harbor extended into the post-war world in complex ways. On one hand, the attack taught the importance of carrier aviation. The Japanese had demonstrated that carriers were more important than battleships, that aircraft could defeat surface ships. The American Navy learned that lesson and built its post-war fleet around carriers, a decision that would dominate naval strategy for the next 80 years. Every major American military operation since World War II has involved carrier air power in some capacity. On the other hand, the attack reinforced some problematic patterns in American thinking. The idea that America had been treacherously attacked by a perfidious enemy while peacefully minding its own business became a narrative that ignored the ways American policy had contributed to the crisis. The oil embargo, the support for China, The opposition to Japanese expansion. These were conscious American policy choices that had pushed Japan toward war. That doesn't excuse the attack on Pearl Harbor, which was certainly a violation of international norms and killed thousands of people who were not responsible for American policy. But it complicates the simple good versus evil narrative that became the dominant American understanding of the event. The attack also enshrined a certain way of thinking about surprise attacks that may not be entirely helpful. The idea that Pearl Harbor happened because commanders were incompetent or because intelligence failed ignores the reality that surprise is inherent to warfare. No matter how good your intelligence, no matter how alert your commanders, a determined enemy who is willing to take risks can usually achieve tactical surprise. The Japanese took enormous risks to attack Pearl Harbor, crossing thousands of miles of ocean in radio silence, betting that they wouldn't be spotted, launching the attack, even though discovery would have meant the destruction of their carrier force. The attack succeeded because they were willing to gamble everything, not because American commanders were particularly incompetent. The search for scapegoats after Pearl Harbor led to Admiral Kimmel and General Short being blamed for the disaster, their careers ruined, their reputations destroyed. Multiple investigations over the years have suggested that they were not primarily responsible, that Washington shares much of the blame for not providing adequate intelligence or clear warnings. In 1999, the U.S. Senate passed a resolution stating that both Kimmel and Short had been unfairly blamed and recommending that they be posthumously restored to their highest ranks. The Department of Defense refused, and both men remain officially demoted to this day, more than 80 years after the attack. For the families of those who died at Pearl Harbor, the legacy is deeply personal. Many families continue to visit the Arizona Memorial, bringing flowers, sometimes bringing the ashes of a survivor who requested to be interred with his shipmates. The Navy allows survivors to be interred on the Arizona, lowering urns containing their ashes into the ship during special ceremonies. It's a way of reuniting the crew, of allowing men who escaped to rejoin their friends who didn't. The identification of remains from the Oklahoma represents a remarkable achievement of forensic science. For decades, hundreds of Oklahoma sailors remained buried in mass graves as unknowns, their families never having received closure. Starting in 2015, the Defense POWWMIA Accounting Agency began a systematic effort to identify these remains using DNA analysis. By 2021, all 429 Oklahoma crew members who died had been identified, and remains were returned to families for burial. It's impossible to overstate what this meant to the families, some of whom had waited nearly 80 years to finally bury their father or uncle or brother in a marked grave with his name on it. The physical scars of Pearl Harbor have largely healed. The harbor is active again, home to the Pacific Fleet. The airfields are rebuilt and operational. Ford Island, once the flaming center of the attack, is now home to modern facilities and a small community of military families. You can drive around the island, past the old hangars that still bear bullet holes from December 7th, past the memorials, past the modern warships tied up at docks that were once occupied by the casualties of the attack. But the emotional and psychological scars remain. For the survivors, Pearl Harbor defined their lives. No matter what else they accomplished, no matter how long they lived, They were always Pearl Harbor survivors first. The attack gave them a shared identity, a bond with others who had experienced the same trauma. Many of them struggled with what we now call PTSD, nightmares, flashbacks, survivor guilt. In the 1940s, such conditions were poorly understood and even more poorly treated. Men were expected to get over it and move on. Many did so by never talking about their experiences, burying the memories deep, carrying the burden alone. The ones who did talk, who wrote memoirs or gave interviews or spoke to school groups, often said they did it because they felt an obligation to their shipmates who died. The dead couldn't tell their own stories, so the survivors had to tell the stories for them. They had to make sure that people remembered that the sacrifice wasn't forgotten, that the 403 Americans who died that Sunday morning didn't die in vain. So, Part 9, The Morning After, Forever Changed. Remember where we started? You, trapped in the capsizing Oklahoma, water rising in the darkness, the ship groaning its death song around you. Those minutes felt like hours. The terror, the confusion, the desperate hope that someone would reach you before the air ran out or the water rose too high. That opening, your experience in this telling, is drawn from the accounts of men like Stephen Bauer Young and the other 31 survivors who were cut from the Oklahoma's hull. This personal perspective, woven throughout, represents the experiences of thousands of sailors at Pearl Harbor, merged into one voice to help us understand what it meant to be there. When we say you survived or you did something, understand that it represents what many experienced. Some lived to tell their stories, others didn't get that chance. The sailor's voice in this narrative could be any of the thousands who were there that morning. Now you're standing on the deck of a ship, perhaps your own, perhaps one you swam to during the attack, looking out across Pearl Harbor. It's December 8th, 1941, just 24 hours ago, this harbor was at peace. Now it looks like the end of the world. Columns of smoke still rise from the Arizona's shattered hulk. Oil fires still burn on the water's surface, creating an acrid haze that stings your eyes and catches in your throat. The smell is overwhelming. A mixture of fuel oil and burnt paint, and something else you're trying not to think about too hard. If your ship survived with relatively light damage, you're one of the lucky ones. But you don't feel lucky. You feel numb, disconnected, like you're moving through a dream or watching someone else's life unfold. You haven't slept more than an hour since the attack. None of you have. There's been too much to do, too many bodies to recover, too many fires to fight, too much wreckage to clear. A motor launch passes by, heading toward the Oklahoma's capsized hull, where rescue crews are still cutting through the steel with torches, still pulling out survivors. You watch the boat's wake spreading across the oil-slicked water, ripples disturbing the rainbow sheen. Someone nearby mentions that they got 4 more men out this morning, trapped for more than a day, but still alive. 4 more miracles in a place where miracles seem to have run out. You think about the future, though, it's hard to imagine beyond the immediate tasks of cleanup and repair. The scuttlebutt is that America is at war now, officially. That Congress voted yesterday to declare war on Japan. More than that, Germany and Italy have declared war on America. So now it's a global conflict, fighting on 2 fronts, the thing that America has been trying to avoid for years. And you're going to be part of it, however long it takes. The chief petty officer appears and barks orders for the next work detail. There's a damaged bulkhead that needs shoring up, supplies that need to be moved, a dozen tasks that require doing before the ship can be considered seaworthy again. You follow him below decks, grateful in a way for the distraction, for something to do with your hands that keeps your mind occupied and away from the images that keep trying to force their way in. Your friend's face as he fell, the screaming from the sealed compartment, the bodies floating in the oil. Days turn into weeks. The base slowly returns to a new kind of normal, though it will never be the same as it was before December 7th. New ships arrive to replace those that were lost. New aircraft are flown in. The sunken vessels begin their slow resurrections as salvage teams work around the clock. Some ships, like the Nevada and the California, will be raised and repaired. Others, like the Arizona, are beyond salvation and will remain where they are, transformed from warships into memorials. You receive orders. Your ship is being assigned to escort duty, protecting the convoy routes between Hawaii and the West Coast, guarding against Japanese submarines that might try to disrupt the flow of supplies and reinforcements. It's not glamorous work, but it's necessary. And you're glad to be doing something active, something that feels like striking back against the enemy rather than just cleaning up the damage they caused. Before you leave Pearl Harbor, you attend one more memorial service. The base chaplain speaks about sacrifice and duty and the price of freedom. Taps plays while the honor guard fires a salute. Flags are folded and presented to tearful widows and mothers. You stand at attention, eyes forward, but your mind is elsewhere, remembering the men who didn't make it, whose names are being read aloud now. Each one a person you knew or knew of. Someone who was alive and laughing and complaining about Navy coffee just days ago and is now gone forever. When the service ends, you file past the memorial markers that have been set up, temporary wooden crosses, until proper headstones can be carved. So many names, so many men who will never go home. You think about writing a letter to your family, trying to explain what happened, what you saw, how you feel. But what would you say? How do you put something like this into words? In the end, you decide to wait. Maybe someday you'll find the right words. Maybe someday the memories will be distant enough that you can examine them without feeling like you're going to break. For now, you focus on the immediate future. Your ship is putting to sea tomorrow morning. There's a war to fight, and you're going to fight it. Not for grand strategic reasons or abstract principles, though those matter too. You're going to fight it for your shipmates who died at Pearl Harbor, who never got the chance to strike back. You're going to fight it because someone needs to, and you're here, and you're able, and that will have to be enough. The sea is the same as it always was, indifferent to human concerns, vast and deep and unchanging. Your ship cuts through the swells, heading toward whatever comes next. Behind you, Pearl Harbor recedes into the distance, the smoke still visible on the horizon. A reminder of where you've been and why you're going where you're going. The officers don't know when you'll return. Months probably, maybe longer. There are rumors that the whole Pacific campaign could take years. You stand your watch, scanning the horizon for periscopes or aircraft, alert in a way you weren't before December 7th. None of you will ever be caught unprepared again. The attack taught you that lesson brutally, and it's one you'll carry for the rest of your life. The world is dangerous. Death can come without warning. And the only response is to stay vigilant, stay ready, stay together. Years later, long after the war is over, you'll return to Pearl Harbor as a civilian. The base will look different, but also strangely familiar. The bullet holes in the old hangars will still be there, preserved as historical markers. The Arizona Memorial will be there, white and serene, spanning the sunken hull of the ship that took so many of your friends. You'll walk through it, reading the names on the marble wall, and the memories will come flooding back with unexpected force. You'll cry then, though you didn't let yourself cry in 1941. You'll cry for the men you lost, for the youth you lost, for the innocence that America lost on that Sunday morning. You'll cry because you survived, and they didn't. And no matter how many years pass, that fact will never make complete sense. Why you? Why did you get to go home, get married, have children, live a long life, while they were frozen at 18 or 20 or 22, their potential unfulfilled, their futures erased? There are no good answers to those questions. Survival is often random, a matter of being in the right place at the right moment, making the right choice, having the right bit of luck. It doesn't mean you deserved it more than they did. It just means you got to live, and they didn't. And you carry that knowledge like a weight you can never quite put down. But you also carry something else. The responsibility to remember, to tell the story, to make sure that the sacrifice meant something. You talk to your children and grandchildren about Pearl Harbor, though it's difficult and they don't always understand. How could they? They've grown up in a different world, one shaped by the war you fought, but insulated from its immediate horrors. They know Pearl Harbor as a historical event, something they learned about in school, not as a personal trauma that echoes through decades. You explain it as best you can. You tell them about the ships and the men, about the attack and the aftermath, about what it meant to be 20 years old and watching your world literally explode around you. You tell them about the noise and the fear and the confusion, and how somehow, in the middle of all that chaos, people still did their jobs, still helped each other, still showed courage and kindness and humanity. You tell them that Pearl Harbor wasn't just about the attack itself, but about everything that came after. The determination to rebuild, the commitment to fight back, the unity of a nation that had been divided and suddenly wasn't. You tell them that out of tragedy came resolve. Out of defeat came eventual victory. Out of death came a reaffirmation of life and freedom and the values worth fighting for. And you tell them to remember. Because someday you won't be here to tell the story anymore. Someday, all the survivors will be gone, and Pearl Harbor will be nothing more than words in history books and images in documentaries. But as long as someone remembers, as long as someone visits the memorial and reads the names and understands what happened there, the men who died won't be truly gone. They'll live on in memory, in history, in the lessons their sacrifice taught. That's the legacy of Pearl Harbor. Not just the military lessons about preparedness and intelligence and the importance of carriers, not just the political lessons about American involvement in world affairs, but the human lessons about courage and sacrifice, about ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, about how individuals respond when their world is torn apart and they have to find the strength to keep going. December 7th, 1941 was a date that lived in infamy, as Roosevelt said. But it was also a date that revealed the best of humanity alongside the worst. It was a day of death and destruction, but also a day of heroism and self-sacrifice. It was the day America was attacked, but also the day America began to fight back. A fight that would continue for 4 years until final victory was achieved. The sailors who experienced that day, who survived it and carried its memories for the rest of their lives, were changed forever. They understood in a visceral way that freedom isn't free, that peace can be shattered in an instant, that the comfortable assumptions of peacetime can evaporate in the smoke and fire of war. They understood that evil exists in the world and sometimes must be fought with force. And they understood that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary challenges, can rise to meet them, can do things they never imagined themselves capable of, can become the heroes that the moment demands. That's what Pearl Harbor meant, in the end. Not just a military defeat or a strategic surprise or a catalyst for war, but a test of the American character, a crucible that revealed both the nation's vulnerabilities and its strengths. The attack showed that America could be hurt, but also that America would not be broken. It showed that Americans could be killed, but also that more Americans would rise to take their place. It showed that the nation could suffer a devastating blow and respond not with despair, but with determination. And so the legacy endures, carried forward by the survivors as long as they lived, and now carried forward by the rest of us who never experienced that day but learn from it. We learn about vigilance and preparedness. We learn about sacrifice and service. We learn about the price of freedom and the cost of peace. We learn that history isn't just something that happens in books, but something lived by real people. People who woke up on an ordinary Sunday morning, not knowing they were about to live through one of the most significant days in American history. Closing reflection. Remembering forward. The water of Pearl Harbor is calm today, reflecting the Hawaiian sun in 1,000 dancing points of light. Tourist boats ferry visitors to the Arizona Memorial, their wakes spreading across the surface, temporary disturbances that smooth themselves out within seconds. Below, in the darkness of the harbor bottom, the Arizona rests, steel gradually corroding, structure slowly collapsing, but still present, still there, still bleeding a little oil that rises to mark its presence. If you stand on the memorial and look down through the water on a clear day, you can see the outlines of the ship below. The turret barbettes are visible as dark shadows. The superstructure is gone, cut away decades ago, but the hull remains, a ghost beneath the surface, a reminder that refuses to fade completely. And if you're quiet, if you really listen, you might almost hear the echoes of that Sunday morning, the voices of sailors who will be forever young, forever standing watch, forever part of this place. But here's what those sailors would want you to know, what survivors spent their lives trying to explain. Pearl Harbor wasn't about ships or strategy or the beginning of a war. It was about people. It was about 20-year-olds who went to bed on Saturday night thinking about home and woke up on Sunday morning facing death. It was about decisions made in seconds that meant survival or drowning. It was about ordinary people discovering extraordinary courage they didn't know they possessed. It was about Doris Miller grabbing that gun despite never being trained on it, because his shipmates needed him. About Joe George throwing a line to men trapped on the burning Arizona, giving them a way across when there was no other escape. About Julio de Castro cutting through steel for 36 hours straight because he could hear men tapping from inside the Oklahoma. About sailors pulling survivors from burning oil, even though they knew they might not make it back themselves. The story of Pearl Harbor is ultimately about transformation, the transformation of a nation from peace to war, the transformation of young men from civilians to warriors, the transformation of ordinary Sunday routine into extraordinary historical significance, and the transformation of tragedy into meaning, of death into memory, of loss into legacy. We tell the story not because it's pleasant, it isn't, but because it's necessary. Because the men who died there deserve to be remembered not as statistics, but as individuals. Because the lessons of that day remain relevant, about the importance of vigilance, about the necessity of standing against aggression, about the power of unity in the face of threat, and about the courage ordinary people can show when circumstances demand it. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about those sailors from another era, waking up on what they thought was just another Sunday, unaware that their names were about to be written into history. Think about their courage, their sacrifice, their humanity in the midst of inhumanity. Think about how their experience shaped the world you live in today, how the choices made in those desperate hours continue to echo through the decades. Remember them, not just on December 7th, not just when you visit Hawaii, not just when a documentary airs or an anniversary rolls around. Remember them as people, as individuals who lived and loved and died far too young. Remember them because that's what they would have wanted. To be remembered not as symbols, but as sailors who served their country and paid the ultimate price. The sun sets over Pearl Harbor every evening, painting the sky in colors of orange and purple and red, colors that might remind you of fire if you let them, but that are also simply beautiful. A reminder that life continues, that beauty persists, that hope endures even in places marked by tragedy. Remember Pearl Harbor. Remember the men who died there. Remember the survivors who carried their memories for decades. Remember, and in remembering, honor their sacrifice by building a world worthy of it. The story ends, but the memory continues. The last survivors are gone or going, but the memorial remains. The ships have long since been raised or scrapped or consigned to the harbor bottom, but the lessons persist. Pearl Harbor is history, but it's also present, a living memory that shapes how we think about war and peace, preparedness and sacrifice, duty and honor. Sleep well, knowing that those who came before you stood watch in their time, fought their battles, made their sacrifices. Their legacy is not just what they did, but what we do with the world they helped preserve, the freedom they died to protect, the future they ensured would exist, even though they weren't there to see it. Remember Pearl Harbor. Remember always. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through one of the most significant days in American history. If you found this video helpful or moving, please consider subscribing to Sleepable History, where we explore the past with the depth and respect it deserves. Hit that like button if this resonated with you, and share it with anyone who wants to understand what really happened on December 7th, 1941. Until next time, sleep well and never forget.